Hey guys, tonight we journey back thousands of years to the banks of the Nile, to a civilization known for pyramids, pharaohs and gods that watched your every move.
But behind the gold masks and grand temples lies a much harsher reality.
Today we're asking, what would really happen if you lived just one day in ancient Egypt? Because let me tell you, the sun isn't the only thing that will roast you alive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you.
It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome to ancient Egypt, land of pyramids, gods and relentless ultraviolet violence. Before you even open your eyes, the sun is already blasting through your reed hut, like it's auditioning for the role of unforgiving spy god. There are no curtains, no shades, and certainly no air conditioning.
Just the raw, unforgiving heat of the desert, baking everything, including you. By breakfast,
you're lying on a straw mat with a linen sheet that's more suggestion than protection.
The Nile breeze you were promised in all those travel documentaries? Yeah, it's gone.
Probably died sometime around 2800 BC.
By the time you stumble outside, the temperature is already flirting with 90 degrees Fahrenheit, or around 30 to Celsius, and it's not even mid-morning.
The sun doesn't just shine in ancient Egypt, it attacks.
Your linen tunic, useless. It's like wearing tissue paper in a sauna. And don't even think about sunscreen. There's no aloe vera, no SPF 50, not even a floppy hat with a logo from a beach resort. Ancient Egyptians did have protective oils, but unless you're wealthy or work in a temple, you're not getting any of it.
Your best option, smear yourself with mud or crocodile dung, which apparently might keep you from turning into a human torch.
Emphasis on might. By midday, the stones under your feet are hot enough to cook lentils. Shade is a luxury. Trees are rare. You might get a little relief hiding behind a mud brick wall, but even that wall is sweating by now. You, on the other hand, look like someone threw you into a clay oven and forgot to set a timer, and you better not complain.
I, the sun god, is watching. And in ancient Egypt, the sun wasn't just weather, it was divine authority.
The hotter the day, the more powerful I was feeling.
So basically, if you're melting, it's a spiritual compliment.
In short, surviving one day in ancient Egypt requires hydration, humility, and an ironclad tolerance for feeling like a roast chicken.
And this is just the morning. You're finally out of bed, or rather, of your scratchy straw mat.
And the good news is, the Nile is just a short walk away.
The bad news? You can already smell it before you see it. Yes, the mighty Nile, the life-giver of ancient Egypt, revered as sacred. The reason civilization here even exists.
But let's be honest, it also smells like a fish market had a bad breakup with a swamp.
The banks are buzzing with FLIs, frogs, and things that probably shouldn't have legs but do. Still, this is where you bathe. Soap hasn't been invented yet, and even if it had, you couldn't afford it.
Instead, you lather yourself in the freshest cleansing technology of the day, sand.
That's right, exfoliation the Egyptian way.
Just rub yourself down with coarse grains and call it skincare.
It's like nature's sandpaper, but less effective.
Washing clothes?
Also done in the Nile.
And by washing, we mean pounding them against rocks, while praying that a crocodile doesn't mistake your laundry for a tasty midday snack.
Oh, and just to make things more fun, let's not forget the occasional sewage runoff from upstream. Remember, people, livestock, and the occasional funeral boat all share this river.
And yet, somehow, this is considered clean. You scrub rinse, and emerge feeling slightly less sticky and only moderately more worried about leeches. If you're a city dweller in Memphis or Thebes, you might be lucky enough to use a public basin or cistern. But for everyone else, it's Nile or nothing. And don't expect privacy.
This is a public bathing space, shared by families, neighbors, livestock, and the odd ibis pecking around your ankles like it pays rent. Water jars are filled and balanced on heads, carried back to your mud brick house before the midday heat turns the clay into toast. It's a daily ritual, spiritual, necessary, and slightly traumatic. So yes, the Nile is sacred. It feeds you, cleans you, and quenches your thirst. But let's not pretend it's a sparkling oasis.
In reality, it's part miracle, part biohazard, and all you've got. By now, you've bathed in the crocodile-infested Nile. You've sandpapered yourself semi-clean,
and your body feels like a baked fig. Time for breakfast, the most important and least glamorous meal of your ancient Egyptian day.
Let's set expectations. If you are picturing a buffet of exotic fruits, honey-draped pastries, or perhaps a nice avocado toast because you are a modern time traveler with specific dietary needs, please lower your standards.
Lower them all the way to the floor, and then dig a little hole. Breakfast for the average Egyptian is bread and onions.
Maybe some garlic if you are feeling fancy. And when I say bread, I don't mean a soft, fluffy loaf from a Parisian bakery.
I mean a dense, heavy slab of grains that has a very special secret ingredient.
Sand.
You see, in ancient Egypt, sand is everywhere. It's in your shoes, it's in your bed, and unfortunately, it is heavily involved in the culinary arts.
The grain is ground down using stone tools. These stones grind against each other, and tiny particles of rock and grit fall into the flour.
It is unavoidable. So, every bite of bread you take is an act of erosion against your own enamel.
Chewing is a risky game.
You take a bite and crunch.
That wasn't a seed.
That was a piece of quartzite. Over time, this wears your teeth down to flat, painful little stumps.
In fact, if we look at the mummies of ancient commoners, their teeth are often in terrible condition, worn down to the nerve.
So, as you sit there in the growing heat, gnawing on your rock bread, just remember that you are slowly eating your own dental health.
But you need to wash that grit down with something.
You reach for a clay jar. Is it water? No, drinking the water straight, unless you just boiled it, is a gamble you don't want to take. Dysentery is not a fun way to spend your afternoon.
Instead, you drink beer. But again, let's adjust our modern expectations.
This isn't a crisp, cold lager.
It is thick. It is cloudy. It is practically a smoothie made of fermented barley.
It is extremely low in alcohol, which is good because you have work to do, but it is high in calories and nutrients. It is often described as liquid bread. In fact, it is so thick you might almost need to chew it, which, considering the state of your teeth from the actual bread, might be a relief. Everyone drinks it. Men, women, children, the elderly. It is the fuel of the empire.
The pyramids were not built on alien technology.
They were built on a foundation of thick, nutritious, lukewarm beer. So there you are, sitting on the dirt floor of your small home, smelling faintly of river mud, chewing on sandy bread, and sipping heavy beer while staring at a wall that is already radiating heat. It is a humble start. It is a quiet start.
But it is the fuel you need because the day ahead of you is not going to be kind. As you finish your meal, you take a moment to look at your family.
They look just as tired as you feel. The concept of a weekend does not exist. The concept of retirement does not exist.
You work until you physically cannot work anymore.
Your children are running around, perhaps playing with a toy made of clay or a ball made of rags, but soon they will be helping out too.
Childhood in ancient Egypt is short. As soon as you are old enough to carry something or shoo away a bird, you have a job.
You stand up, brushing the crumbs and sand from your linen kilt.
It is time to head out.
If you are a man, you are likely heading to the fields or to a construction site.
If you are a woman, your work is equally grueling, grinding more grain, baking, weaving, raising children, and managing the household, which includes hauling that heavy water from the river we mentioned earlier.
Let's assume, for the sake of this journey, that you are a farmer. Most people are. You step out of your door and the heat hits you again, heavier this time.
The fields stretch out towards the horizon, green strips of life flanking the river, surrounded by the endless, menacing yellow of the desert. This is the Black Land, the fertile soil deposited by the Nile.
It is the only reason you are alive.
Your tool for the day is a hoe, not a modern, lightweight metal hoe. A heavy, wooden tool that you have to swing with force to break the earth.
Or perhaps today is irrigation day. You have to move water from the canals into the fields.
This involves the shadaf. The shadaf is a simple machine, a long pole on a pivot with a bucket on one end and a heavy counterweight on the other.
It looks clever. It looks efficient. But use it for 10 hours straight and tell me how your shoulders feel.
You dip the bucket, pull it up, swing it around, dump the water, and repeat.
Dip, pull, swing, dump. Dip, pull, swing, dump.
The rhythm is hypnotic, but the pain is very real. Your back aches, your arms burn, the sun beats down on your neck, which is already starting to blister despite the mud you smeared on it earlier. And you are not alone in the fields.
Oh no, you have company.
Millions of tiny, buzzing companions, ephelis.
The ephelis in ancient Egypt are legendary. They are persistent, aggressive, and absolutely everywhere. They land on your eyes. They land on your lips.
They land on your sweat-drenched skin. And because you are holding a hoe or a water bucket, you can't even swat them away effectively.
You just have to learn to live with the sensation of tiny legs crawling on your face. It is a test of patience that would break a monk.
Some historical texts describe people carrying fly whisks, but let's be real, you are a peasant.
You don't have a fly whisk, you have your own suffering. There is also the constant threat of something worse than FLIs. Snakes. The cobras in the tall grass do not care about your agricultural quotas.
One wrong step, one moment of distraction, and your day goes from bad to fatal very quickly. Scorpions too love to hide in the shade of rocks or under debris. So every time you reach down to move a stone or pull a weed, you are playing a game of biological roulette. But let's say you survive the morning. The sun is now directly overhead. It is noon.
The world is blindingly bright.
The shadows have disappeared, hiding under the objects that cast them. It is time for a short break.
You find a patch of shade under a rare sycamore tree, or perhaps just the shadow of a marked brick silo.
You sit down in the dust.
You take a sip of lukewarm water from a skin bag.
It tastes like leather and warm river,
but it saves your life.
You look at your hands. They are calloused, cracked, and ingrained with the black soil of the Nile. These are the hands that build empires. Historians love to talk about the pharaohs, the Ramesses and the Tutankhamons, with their gold and their chariots.
But the empire runs on your sweat.
Without you, the grain doesn't grow. Without grain, the soldiers don't eat. Without soldiers, the borders fall.
You are the engine of Egypt, but nobody is going to build a statue of you. As you sit there, you might see a scribe walking past.
He looks different. He is cleaner.
His linen is whiter.
He is soft. He has never swung a hoe in his life. He is holding a pallet of reed pens and a roll of papyrus.
He is here to count. He counts the grain. He counts the cattle. He counts the geese.
He is the tax man.
And in ancient Egypt, taxes are not paid with currency. Money hasn't been invented yet.
Taxes are paid in produce.
You give a portion of everything you grow to the temple and the state.
If the harvest is bad,
that's your problem.
The pharaoh still needs his cut. The scribe looks at you with a mixture of boredom and disdain. He notes something down on his scroll.
You hope he has counted correctly.
If the records show you owe more than you have, the punishment is swift and physical. Beating people for tax evasion or just simple inability to pay is a standard administrative procedure. The bureaucracy of ancient Egypt is highly organized, highly efficient, and utterly ruthless. You nod your head to the scribe, keeping your eyes lowered.
It is best not to draw attention.
In this world, invisibility is safety. The break is over. The overseer shouts,
"Back to work."
The afternoon shift is even harder because you are already exhausted. The heat is heavy, a physical weight pressing on your shoulders.
You go back to the rhythm.
Dip, pull, swing, dump. The repetitive motion puts you in a trance.
You start to daydream.
You dream of the festivals. That is the one light at the end of the tunnel.
During the great festivals, like the festival of Opit or the Feast of the Valley, work stops. The temples open their stores. There is extra beer. There is meat, actual meat, which you almost never eat otherwise.
There is music, dancing, and a sense of community.
It is the only time you feel like more than just a cog in the machine. You hold on to that thought.
The festival is coming. Just a few more weeks. Just a few more thousand buckets of water. As the sun begins to dip lower, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and burnt orange, the workday finally winds down.
You are broken, dirty, and hungry again. You trudge back towards the village.
The air is cooling slightly, but the ground is still radiating the day's heat.
You pass the village healer's hut. Someone is inside, groaning.
Medicine in ancient Egypt is a fascinating mix of genuine observation and absolute nonsense.
If you have a broken bone, they can set it. They are actually quite good at that.
They have splints and bandages.
If you have a wound, they might apply honey, which is a natural antiseptic.
That's the good part.
But if you have an internal illness,
a fever, a stomachache,
well, then things get weird. They might assume you have a demon inside you.
The cure might involve drinking a potion made of crushed beetle shells, ostrich egg, and perhaps some more of that crocodile dung we talked about earlier.
Or they might just chant a spell over you and hope the demon gets bored and leaves. You walk past, hoping you don't get sick.
Sickness is terrifying here. Life expectancy is not high. If you make it to 35, you are doing well. If you make it to 40, you are an elder.
You touch the amulet around your neck, a small faience charm shaped like the Eye of Horus or perhaps the Notch of Isis. It is your spiritual insurance policy.
You pray it works.
You arrive home.
The smell of burning cow dung greets you. It is the primary fuel for cooking fires because wood is too scarce and valuable to burn. So, the village smells of smoke and manure.
It's a scent you don't even notice anymore.
It just smells like home. Your wife is grinding grain again for tomorrow's bread. The sound of stone on stone is the soundtrack of your life.
Grind, crush, grind. Dinner is, well, it's bread and beer again.
Maybe some lentils or chickpeas if you are lucky.
You sit together as a family.
The oil lamp flickers, casting long, dancing shadows on the mud walls. This is the quiet time.
The dangerous time.
The darkness belongs to the spirits and the predators.
You don't go out at night unless you have to.
You talk about the day.
You talk about the river level.
The Nileometer, a structure used to measure the river's depth, is the most important news source in the country. If the water is too low, there will be famine.
If it is too high, it will wash away the villages.
You need it to be just right. Goldilocks conditions.
Your entire existence hangs on the whims of the river.
As you finish your meal, you might engage in a little personal grooming.
Hygiene is important, not just for smell, but for survival. Lice are a constant plague.
Head lice, body lice, they are everywhere. This is why many Egyptians, men and women, shave their heads.
It is not just a fashion statement. It is pest control.
You might wear a wig for special occasions or to protect your scalp from the sun. But underneath, you are bald and smooth.
It is easier to keep clean. You might also apply kohl to your eyes.
You've seen the pictures. The thick black eyeliner.
Again, this isn't just vanity. It's practical. The black galena paint helps reduce the glare of the sun, like ancient football players putting black grease under their eyes. It also contains lead salts which have mild antibacterial properties, helping to ward off eye infections, which are rampant due to the dust and FLIs. So, looking like a goth rock star is actually a health and safety requirement.
The lamp oil is running low.
It is expensive, so you don't waste it.
You blow out the flame. The darkness is absolute.
There is no light pollution here. If you were to step outside, the Milky Way would look like a solid river of light across the sky.
But you stay inside.
You lie back on your mat.
Your muscles twitch as they relax. The silence of the desert settles in, broken only by the distant howl of a jackal or the bark of a stray dog. You have survived one day, just one, and tomorrow I will rise again, angry and hot, and you will do it all over again. But what happens if you aren't a peasant? What if, by some twist of fate, you were born into the golden sandals of the elite? What does life look like when you aren't worried about starving, but rather worried about political assassination, harem intrigues, and the immense pressure of maintaining cosmic order? Well, that is a story for the next leg of our journey.
Because if you think the peasants have it hard, wait until you see the stress levels of the people in charge.
The heat might be the same, but the stakes are entirely different.
Last time, we barely made it through a single, sweaty day as a farmer, surviving on sandy bread and thick beer. But ancient Egypt is not a monolith of suffering.
There are layers to this society, like the layers of expensive oils on a noble skin.
For a very small percentage of the population, life looks less like a struggle for survival and more like
a high-stakes, extremely well-perfumed political drama. Tonight, we move into the inner circle.
Welcome to the golden cage. Imagine waking up not to the blast of the sun through a reed hut, but to the soft rustle of expensive imported linen.
You're lying on a finely carved wooden bed with woven straps, a luxury you share with almost no one. You are, perhaps, a high-ranking official, a seasoned scribe, or maybe even a priest of Amunai, dwelling in the opulent temples of Thebes. You have servants.
You have slaves. You don't have to swing a heavy wooden hoe in 100-degree heat. But don't get too comfortable.
Your life is just as deadly. Only the dangers are quieter, more calculated, and often involve poison.
The heat is still an issue, of course, but you have ways around it. Your home is built not of single-layer mud brick, but of thick, whitewashed brick with high ceilings and small, elevated windows designed to catch the rare and precious breeze.
You have inner courtyards shaded by date palms, and maybe even a small pool or cistern, where the evaporative cooling turns the air soft and breathable. Your morning bath is not in the crocodile-infested Nile. No, your servants bring water to you.
They bathe you in rich oil scented with myrrh and frankincense, which makes you smell less like river slush and more like a walking, very expensive air freshener.
After your bath, you don a pure, pleated linen garment so fine and translucent it almost seems to flow.
You even have sandals made of smooth, soft leather, a far cry from the scratchy papyrus ropes of the common folk. Now for breakfast.
This is where your table looks very different. While the farmer chokes down grit bread, you dine on refined bread, baked from flour sifted multiple times to remove every trace of sand.
There are honey cakes, rich with sweetness.
There are grapes and figs, carefully tended in the temple orchards.
And yes, you still drink beer, because it's a staple, but your beer is light, filtered, and served cool.
You also drink wine, imported from the Delta, or even from foreign lands, poured from elegant amphorae. You sit down to eat, and a servant gently fans you with a large palm frond.
But as you chew your honey cake, your mind is racing.
You are not worried about the river's height. You are worried about the pharaoh's mood.
Unlike the farmer, whose life is dictated by the seasons, your life is dictated by politics.
Every word you say, every gift you accept, every favor you grant is tracked, scrutinized, and analyzed.
Being close to the sun god on earth, the pharaoh, is both the greatest honor and the highest risk.
The closer you are to the throne, the more people want your job, and the more likely they are to whisper deadly rumors in the wrong ear.
You live in a state of constant, low-level anxiety, a soft whisper that says, "Be careful what you sign."
If you are a scribe, your job is immense. You are the backbone of the Egyptian administration. Everything taxes, irrigation records, temple inventory, military orders, legal contracts goes through you.
You are respected, often wealthy, and entirely indispensable.
But you paid a massive price to get here. Imagine sitting down for your day's work. It starts not with an email, but with a roll of papyrus, which, by the way, is incredibly expensive. You unroll it gently. Your task is to write not in a simple alphabet, but in hieroglyphs. This is where the real work begins. Hieroglyphs are beautiful, intricate, and absolutely brutal to master.
They are not just letters.
They are pictures, sounds, and determinatives.
Learning the 700+ common symbols takes years of relentless study. You had to memorize them, learn to draw them perfectly, and understand the context in which each one changes meaning. You spent your childhood copying texts, your wrist cramping, your mind swimming in the language of the gods. And if you make a mistake,
if you miswrite a crucial figure on a tax document, or accidentally write the word for donkey instead of noble,
the consequences could be dire, both for your career and for the district you supervise. The pressure to be flawlessly accurate is immense.
A single misplaced bird symbol could lead to a local rebellion.
You dip your reed pen into your palette, mixing the red ink for titles and corrections and the black ink for the main body.
The silence of your study is broken only by the scratching sound of the reed on the fibrous papyrus. You spend hours hunched over, your eye focusing on the tiny details of a falcon or a cord rope.
It is mentally exhausting work that requires total concentration.
You are managing the logistics of an empire that has lasted for thousands of years. You are the living database. If you are a priest, your duties are even stranger. You don't preach.
You don't necessarily lead services for the public.
Your job is to be the ultimate temple attendant, a spiritual housekeeper for a god.
Your life is defined by ritual cleanliness. You must be pure.
This means you must shave your entire body, head, face, and everything in between every few days to avoid the spiritual impurity of hair.
You must bathe in cold, sacred water multiple times a day. You must abstain from certain foods, like fish or specific meats. Your day revolves around the temple, opening the inner sanctuary, waking the god's statue with chants and prayers, washing the statue, anointing it with oils, and dressing it in fresh linen and gold jewelry.
This is the cult of the god.
It is meticulous, repetitive, and utterly vital.
Because if you mess up the ritual, if you forget to chant or spill the oil, the god could be displeased.
And a displeased god, in the Egyptian worldview, is a cosmic catastrophe.
If the god happy, the god of the Nile inundation, is offended because you didn't shave your armpits properly, he might refuse to flood the river. No flood means no crops. No crops mean famine.
Famine means the end of the world, or at least the end of your career, which, in this society, are often the same thing. You hold the mart, the cosmic order, in your delicate, freshly bathed hands.
Talk about job pressure.
Your wealth is visible, but so are your social restrictions.
The common farmer may worry about scorpions.
You worry about your peers.
The court is a nest of vipers.
Favors are granted and withdrawn instantly. The moment a pharaoh glances at your rival, your position is weakened.
A gift of land is not just a reward, it's a commitment.
Fail to support a certain policy, and that land might be suddenly taken back, leaving you destitute and dishonored. You have everything to lose. And then there is the danger of the forbidden knowledge. Being a scribe or priest means you have access to medical, astronomical, and theological texts that the common person cannot even touch. You understand the movement of the stars. You understand how to prepare the body for the afterlife.
This knowledge is power, and power attracts suspicion. In the New Kingdom especially, the pharaohs and their viziers were always on guard against plots.
A sudden illness in the royal family is never just an illness. It is often suspected to be poison. And who handles the herbs, the specialized grinding stones, and the mystical liquids?
You do.
The priest who prepares the temple offerings, or the scribe who records the medicinal formulas, is always under surveillance. A famous example is the harem conspiracy against Pharaoh Ramesses III. A low-ranking wife, Tiy, wanted her son to inherit the throne.
The plot involved not just political assassinations, but magical attacks.
They hired people with knowledge, scribes and priests, to create magical wax images, essentially ancient voodoo dolls, to paralyze the guards and kill the pharaoh.
The resulting trial involved torture and forced suicides.
Being an elite Egyptian meant being hyper-aware of your place in the food chain. You might have gold sandals, but they are standing on very thin ice.
Even your leisure time is carefully curated. While the farmer collapses after sunset, you attend banquets.
These aren't casual dinners. They are networking events. You arrive, smelling wonderful. You wear a scented fat cone on your head, a cone made of solid, perfumed animal fat that slowly melts over the course of the evening, lubricating and scenting your hair, making you look shiny and feel slightly sticky. Guests are served wine, and entertainment is provided by harpists, lute players, and professional dancers. But while the entertainment is lovely, your mind is still working.
Is that vizier laughing too hard at the joke? Is the governor of Nubia avoiding your gaze? The conversation is always political, always about influence, and often involves subtle insults masked as compliments. You are never truly relaxed. You are performing. You are constantly calculating your alliances. You live in a state of soft, continuous vigilance, which is arguably more exhausting than the farmer's honest, physical toil.
The pressure to be perfect is overwhelming.
The pharaoh isn't just a ruler.
He is the intermediary between humanity and the gods. He is the reason the sun rises. He is the reason the Nile floods.
And you, the elite, are an extension of his divinity. If you fail, the cosmic balance fails. The pressure isn't just to be successful.
It's to prevent the apocalypse.
No pressure at all. So, as the wealthy noble finally retreats to his luxurious bed, having survived a day of politicking, performance, and ritual cleansing, he does so with the distinct and heavy fear that his rival might already have hired a poisoner, or that a forgotten curse in an old papyrus roll might be activated by dawn. In ancient Egypt, the higher you climb, the harder the fall. The silence of the night in a nobleman's palace is not restful. It is just waiting, and that waiting is usually for the next great project. Because the one thing that united every Egyptian, from the lowliest farmer to the highest vizier, was the need for massive, unending public works. They didn't have money to pay taxes, but they had labor. The building of the pyramids, the temples, the canals. This monumental construction shaped the lives of everyone. The question is, how did they manage this colossal logistics problem? How did a society with no wheeled vehicles, no powerful cranes, and no modern surveying equipment build things that still defy our understanding today?
Well, that involves the seasonal life of the average Egyptian and the brutal reality of their employment contract.
Which is where we will go next. We will delve into the economics of the pyramid builders and the terrifying journey of the corvée laborers. We have seen the sunset on the tired farmer's back, and we have felt the anxiety of the noble in his cooled palace. But these two worlds, the black land of the peasant and the white land of the elite, are connected by one massive, irresistible force, the Nile River itself. The Nile is the great calendar of Egypt, and its rhythm dictates the employment and the very existence of every person in the land.
You see, the ancient Egyptian year was divided not into 4 seasons, but into 3, all based entirely on the river's behavior.
There was Akhet, the inundation,
Peret, the emergence,
and Shimu, the harvest.
And it is the season of Akhet that changes everything for 3 or 4 months every year, usually starting around July. The Nile would swell, the water turning dark with rich silt washed down from the Ethiopian highlands.
The river would breach its banks and spread out over the fields. The entire agricultural world would be submerged.
Now, this annual flood is a miracle. It deposits that rich, black, fertile soil that makes Egyptian farming possible.
It's the reason the whole civilization exists. But when the water is covering your fields, what are you, the farmer, supposed to do? You can't farm. You have no work, and you still need to eat. This is where the mighty state steps in, and this is where Corv-e-Labor begins. Corv-e-Labor, known to the Egyptians as Bak, was essentially a national service, a form of temporary, mandatory employment. Since the state provided the safety net during the flood, feeding you and your family, it demanded your labor in return.
And during the flood, when the fields were underwater and movement by boat was easiest, this is when the call went out.
Imagine the sound of the trumpets, or the loud, formal announcement from the vizier's herald in your town square.
The season of a ket has arrived. It is time to drop your simple hoe and pick up a monumental one.
You are being drafted into the greatest construction force the world has ever known. You are going to build eternity.
First, let's address a persistent myth. Despite what epic movies might tell you, the pyramids were not built by generations of foreign slaves whipped into submission. They were built by skilled, organized, and crucially paid Egyptian laborers.
This corvée was mandatory. Yes, and it was hard. But it was viewed as a sacred duty and a form of tax paid to the god king. The entire logistical operation was a marvel of ancient planning. You gather your meager belongings, say goodbye to your family, and join the massive migrating workforce. You travel, often by boat, right over your submerged fields, up to the great quarries near the Nile or across to the Giza Plateau, the site of the greatest construction project in human history.
When you arrive at the workers' village at Giza, things change immediately.
The accommodations are basic long, narrow barracks made of dried mud brick, but they are organized and functional. But the real difference is the food. The diet you get here is significantly better than what you eat at home.
The pharaoh's administration is not stupid. They know you cannot move a 50-ton block of granite on a diet of just sandy bread. You need fuel.
So, the state pours an immense amount of resources into feeding its workforce. Excavations at the Giza Plateau revealed huge bakeries and facilities dedicated to raising cattle and fish.
Your daily ration now includes not just the old thick beer, but also substantial amounts of meat, beef, and goat and fish, often consumed in large quantities.
You are getting the protein you need for immense physical work. Think of it. The very people tasked with building monuments to the divine were being sustained by a highly caloric, centrally planned, and surprisingly high protein diet. They were, in effect, industrial athletes. The organization is military in its precision.
You are assigned to a file or gang, which is divided into smaller units. You work alongside the same men every day.
These work groups have names like the Friends of Khufu or the Builders of Menka.
There is camaraderie. There is competition. There is a sense of belonging to something massive.
This isn't just grueling work.
It is team grueling work.
Imagine the stone. The foundation of the Great Pyramid consists of millions of limestone blocks, each weighing on average around 2.5 tons. The largest granite blocks, used for the king's chamber, weigh up to 50 tons, and you have no wheels, at least not for transport. How do you move 50 tons?
You do it with ropes, sledges, and muscle. First, the stone is quarried.
The limestone is relatively soft and easier to cut. Workers hammer wooden wedges into crevices in the rock face. They soak the wedges with water, causing the wood to swell, cracking the stone naturally.
It is clever, slow, and dangerous work, as fractured rock can shift without warning. Once the block is free, it is loaded onto a wooden sledge.
This sledge does not have wheels.
It slides on the ground.
And here is the secret to moving it across the desert: water and sweat. Modern experiments have shown that pulling a heavy sledge over dry sand is almost impossible.
But if you dampen the sand just ahead of the sledge, the wet sand provides lubrication, dramatically reducing the friction.
So, your job is not just to pull the rope. Your job is to pull the rope while a fellow laborer constantly pours precious Nile water onto the ground in front of the sledge runners. The air is thick with dust, the smell of damp sand, and the raw, heavy stench of human effort. You are one of 20 or 50 men leaning into a thick rope, your shoulder scraping raw against the rough fibber, chanting a rhythm to keep the pace, your feet dragging in the muddy track. Every muscle in your body is screaming. You can feel the strain in your core, your legs, your back, and your throat from the constant, necessary shouting. And this is just moving the stone to the base of the pyramid.
To get the stones up, the Egyptians used enormous, sophisticated ramps.
There were probably several types of ramps winding around the structure or straight up one face.
Imagine pulling the 2.5-ton block, not just across flat ground, but up a 10 or 15-degree incline in the midday sun.
The air shimmers with heat. The humidity of the Nile adds a thick, smothering layer to the desert air. A slip on the wet ramp, a moment of distraction. A frayed rope and a 2.5-ton block can roll back down, turning your entire team into a catastrophic pile of broken bones and crushed limestone. The work is constantly hazardous. Your body is pushed past any modern limit. You are, in essence, operating at the physical maximum of what a human body can sustain, fueled by government-provided beef and thick and nutritious beer. The noise is constant.
The dull thud of stones being set into place,
The crack of the quarry hammers, the rhythmic chant of the teams pulling the ropes, the shouts of the overseers, who are usually scribes or skilled foremen.
they are not necessarily cruel, but they are absolutely relentless.
The project must be completed, because the pharaoh needs his eternal resting place.
He needs to transition from this world to the next to maintain Mart, the cosmic order, and your back is part of that maintenance plan.
You work for days, weeks, months, seeing the structure grow steadily higher, each perfectly placed stone a testament to your collective agony. There are no vacations. There is no sick leave. If you are injured, the camp has its own medical facilities and, as we mentioned, they are surprisingly good at setting fractures.
But if you can still move, you are expected to work. Imagine spending your days on the top of the ever-growing pyramid.
The higher you go, the hotter the sun, and the less shade there is. You are hundreds of feet up, pulling stones across a ramp, the wind whipping the dust into your eyes, the massive structure tilting the world around you.
You look out and you can see the endless, green-ribboned black land, your home, the place you are desperately trying to protect through this divine labor. But there is a spiritual reward. When a block is finally maneuvered into its perfect, microscopic capsized place, there is a sense of accomplishment that is truly beyond measure.
You are not just building a building. You are participating in a divine act. You are ensuring the pharaoh's safe passage, and thus securing the flood for next year. You are helping to keep the sun god eye on his course across the sky. You are a small, sweaty, sandy part of eternity, and that feeling is powerful enough to motivate the immense suffering. As the flood waters eventually recede and the season of Perit, the emergence, begins, the call comes again.
The core of duty is over.
You are released. You are paid in grain, beer, and perhaps a small bonus of dried fish. You are exhausted. Your hands are raw. Your back is permanently stiff. And you have probably lost a few pieces of dental enamel to the sandy food.
But you are also well fed, and you have survived. You return to your village with stories, with a slightly deeper purse of grain, and with the pride of having served the king.
You exchange the sledge and the rope for your simple wooden hoe, and you return to the black land, preparing the newly emerged, fertile soil for planting. You have exchanged one form of back-breaking labor for another. The experience of the pyramid builders is a perfect encapsulation of ancient Egypt. Incredible organization, brutal demands, but underwritten by a profound sense of purpose and a functional, if severe, social contract.
You gave your labor, and the state gave you food and eternal religious significance.
But what about the truly dark side of Egyptian life? We have avoided the topic of actual, non-corvée, chattel slavery, and we have skirted around the things that go bump in the night, the creatures, the spirits, and the things that genuinely terrify an ancient mind. The physical work is one thing, but the mental burden of living in a world full of unseen, hostile forces is another entirely. Next, we will put down the hoe and the rope and step into the dangerous world of ancient Egyptian medicine, magic, and pestilence. This is where the unseen dangers of the Nile truly come to life. We have explored the unrelenting heat, the sand-laced diet, the communal stench of the Nile, and the bone-crushing labor of the Egyptian world. But surviving ancient Egypt wasn't just about winning a battle against heat and stone. It was about fighting an unseen war against a world teeming with tiny, silent killers, and a night sky populated by hostile, restless spirits. Tonight, we enter the realm of plagues, potions, and the power of magic. The Nile, the sacred, life-giving river, is also the source of unimaginable biological menace.
As a farmer, a builder, or even a noble taking a ritual dip, you spend your life wading, drinking, or cleaning in the river.
This constant proximity to the water puts you in direct contact with one of Egypt's most persistent and debilitating foes, schistosomiasis, or as we know it today, bilharzia.
Imagine tiny, microscopic, free-swimming larvae. They are released by common freshwater snails that thrive in the irrigation canals and the shallow, muddy banks of the Nile.
These parasites pierce your skin effortlessly.
You don't feel it.
It is a silent, gentle invasion.
Once inside, they mature and migrate to your bladder or bowels, where they settle, reproduce, and spend the rest of your life slowly destroying your organs.
The symptoms are chronic, debilitating, and inescapable internal bleeding, abdominal pain, fatigue so profound it feels like a spiritual curse, and eventually liver and bladder damage. This condition was so widespread that historians have found evidence of its presence in Egyptian mummies.
Nearly everyone suffered from it to some degree. You weren't just tired from working a 14-hour day in the quarry.
You were tired because a parasite the size of a thread was quietly eating your insides. It's a slow, quiet death sentence delivered by the very water that sustains you.
And schistosomiasis is only the start of your biological woes. Life in a dense, hot, and often poorly drained community means you live in a microbial soup. Trachoma, a horrific bacterial eye infection, is rampant, spread by the ubiquitous Egyptian fly.
Your eyes are constantly irritated by the dust and the ephelies that flop to any moisture.
The disease causes scarring on the inner eyelid, which eventually turns inward, causing your eyelashes to scratch your cornea with every blink. It is agonizing, it causes permanent, blurring vision, and it is almost universal. Look at the artistic representations of many commoners. They are often depicted squinting. They weren't just posing dramatically.
They were trying to survive. Then you have the constant low-level war with the vermin.
Rats and mice live in the grain silos, contaminating the food supply with their droppings, which, of course, carried their own brand of quiet death. We are thousands of years before the Great Plagues, but fevers, typhus, and dysentery are constant companions, especially among children.
If you had a child survive past the age of 5, you considered yourself profoundly blessed by the gods. When you do fall ill, you turn to the medical practitioners. And here, we must divide Egyptian medicine into two distinct categories, the science and the sorcery. In the category of the science, the Egyptians were surprisingly pragmatic masters.
If you broke your arm or smashed your foot in the quarry, they could set the bone with incredible precision.
They had splints, bandages, and even an understanding of basic wound hygiene.
We have the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a surgical text dating back over 3,600 years, which methodically describes 48 different types of injuries, offering logical diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. It is astonishingly rational.
For instance, if a doctor recognized an injury as being beyond his skill, like a catastrophic head wound, the papyrus tells him, simply, an ailment not to be treated. This professional honesty is remarkable.
They knew their limits, but when an ailment was internal, invisible, or chronic, that is when the science ended and the sorcery began.
If a patient suffered from a cough, a stomach ache, or even that creeping fatigue from bilharzia, the diagnosis was rarely biological. It was spiritual.
The pain was caused by an angry ancestor, a territorial demon, or a malicious spell cast by a rival.
And the cure often reflected this supernatural diagnosis. Imagine lying in your bed, feverish, and a doctor approaches you with a remedy from the famous Ebers Papyrus. This text contains over 800 recipes, and some of them are truly
unforgettable. For an issue with the eyes, you might be given an ointment made of lizard's blood, bat's tears, and pig's eyes, all mixed with honey. Why? Because the ingredients were grotesque enough to terrify the demon causing the infection into leaving your body.
For a burn, the recommendation might be to apply a salve made of human excrement. While the honey and oil mixed in may have had a soothing effect, the inclusion of dung, which is packed with bacteria, was clearly a fatal biological error.
The underlying thought process was that the evil spirit couldn't possibly stand the foulness and would flee.
The fact that the patient often followed the demon out of the body was considered an unfortunate side effect.
One remedy for a mysterious skin rash involved crushing a dead mouse and applying it directly to the rash.
You just had to hope the mouse hadn't been carrying the plague when it died. The whole of daily life was saturated with this magical thinking. You couldn't trust your body, and you certainly couldn't trust the unseen world. You carried amulets not just for decoration, but as vital protective gear.
The Eye of Horus was the equivalent of a modern insurance policy.
It wards off the evil eye, protects against accidental injury, and ensures your vision stays clear.
You sleep with a Taurit amulet, the hippopotamus goddess, placed near your bed to protect your children from the demons that stalk the night.
The spiritual dangers are constant.
You must pay careful attention to the calendar, because certain days are designated as evil days, when it is unlucky or even dangerous to cut your nails, go outside, or even say certain words.
Everything you do is monitored by divine and demonic forces, and the night itself is a psychological nightmare. When the sun god Eye dips below the horizon and begins his perilous journey through the underworld, The duet, the world of the living, is plunged into a chaotic darkness. There are no streetlights.
There is no moon on many nights.
The darkness is total, heavy, and full of sounds that your ancient paranoid brain interprets as danger. This is the time when the Eku, the restless dead, can walk. These are the disgruntled spirits who were not properly buried, or who hold a grudge against the living.
They can bring sickness, bad luck, or even death. You lock your flimsy mud brick door and tell your family to stay quiet.
You hope your amulets are strong enough, and you hope the local priest has performed the necessary protective rituals at sunset. You are afraid of the jackals and the crocodiles, of course, but the real fear is of the things you cannot see, the curses you cannot feel until it is too late.
And the invisible malice of the gods or the dark forces of ISFET, the chaotic imbalance that is constantly trying to undermine Mart. Imagine the profound psychological burden of living this way.
You are tired from work, sick from parasites. Your vision is deteriorating from trachoma. And every time you hear a strange scratching sound outside your hut, you don't think rat. You think vengeful ghost. This low-level, high-stakes anxiety is perpetual.
It is a slow, quiet poison on the soul.
And yet, you survive. You survive because the system is designed to keep going. The state is vast, powerful, and utterly obsessed with order, not just in this world, but in the next. The entire society is structured to ensure that everyone, from the lowliest farmer to the high priest, knows exactly where they stand in the divine hierarchy. This obsession with order leads to the final, fascinating pillar of Egyptian life: justice and the law.
If life is a terrifying blend of science and sorcery, how does a massive empire keep people from simply killing each other and stealing the neighbor's sandy bread?
What happens when the spirit you are fighting is not a demon, but a person?
And what happens when the pharaoh, the living god, has to settle a local dispute over a missing goat? We have navigated the physical dangers of the field and the palace, and the unseen terrors of the microbial and magical world.
But for a civilization to last 3,000 years, it needs more than just pyramids and prayers.
It needs order. It needs a universal, immovable truth that binds everyone together, from the pharaoh to the person scrubbing clothes in the river.
In ancient Egypt, this concept was called Mart.
Mart is the quiet foundation upon which the entire world rests.
It is often translated as truth, justice, and cosmic order.
It is the deep, fundamental balance of the universe.
When you go to sleep at night,
the Egyptian believes that Mart is the reason the sun will rise again.
When you eat your sandy bread, Mart is the reason the Nile flooded just enough for the grain to grow. The opposite of Mart is ISFET, or chaos.
ISFET is the disorder, the malicious spirit, the unexpected famine, the treasonous plot.
Every action of the pharaoh, every ritual of the priest, and every day of your life is dedicated to maintaining Mart and pushing back ISFET.
And the human mechanism for maintaining Mart is the law.
The law is considered a divine gift. It flows directly from the pharaoh, the living god on earth, who is the high priest of Mart. But the pharaoh is too busy ruling and communing with the actual gods to deal with petty arguments over a stolen jar of beer. So, he delegates the heaviest burden of the empire to his chief administrator, the vizier.
If you were a vizier, you would be the second most powerful man in the kingdom.
You are the final authority on everything from tax assessment to military mobilization. But your most sacred and most terrifying duty is to be the chief justice.
Your court is the highest court in the land, and on your chest you wear the symbol of your office, a heavy golden amulet of the goddess Mart herself, depicted as a woman with an ostrich feather on her head.
The weight of that feather is the weight of the entire universe. The vizier starts his day by receiving the reports from the regional governors and scribes. He is the master of the bureaucracy.
But after the administrative tasks are done, the law courts open, and this is where the system gets surprisingly progressive. Unlike many ancient societies, Egyptian law was remarkably egalitarian, at least on paper.
The court system was theoretically open to everyone. A simple farmer could, and often did, bring a lawsuit against a high noble or even a priest of the most powerful temple. Your social standing did not prevent you from seeking justice.
It just sometimes made the outcome a bit more
predictable. The local courts were called the Kenbet, and they were often run by the mayor or panel of local elders. This is where most everyday disputes were settled. Arguments over property lines, complaints about a neighbor stealing water from a canal, or a broken marriage contract. The process was simple. The two parties would stand before the court and state their case, often with much passion and dramatic appeal. There were no professional lawyers as we know them. You had to speak for yourself. This meant the ability to tell a clear, concise, and persuasive story was vital. The process relied heavily on witnesses and written evidence. Scribes, those administrative powerhouses we discussed earlier, are crucial here.
They would be present to record the entire proceeding onto a papyrus scroll.
Every statement, every accusation, every piece of evidence was meticulously written down.
These records were then archived, providing an astonishing wealth of historical detail that survives even today. The scribe's pen was the true keeper of the law. When it came to property disputes, the land records held by the state were paramount.
If you claimed a certain field was yours, the court would send a team to verify the boundary markers against the master scrolls kept in the temple archives.
The law, therefore, was heavily reliant on the massive, effective, and often overwhelming bureaucracy. But what happens when the evidence is contradictory?
What if two parties simply refuse to admit they are lying? This is where the Egyptian courts had a fascinating, almost theatrical system for finding the truth, the solemn oath.
When a case was completely deadlocked, the court might demand that one party take a solemn oath in the name of the pharaoh or a powerful local god. The belief was simple. No rational Egyptian would dare lie under a powerful oath, because the divine punishment, the intervention of Is-Fet, would be swift and terrible, often meaning a slow, agonizing death for the oath breaker.
The weight of the entire spiritual universe was brought to bear on a simple property dispute. The penalties for breaking the law were intended to be a deterrent, a clear message written on the bodies of the offenders. Ancient Egypt did not have prisons as we understand them, places to reform criminals. The punishment was the sentence. For minor offences, the penalty was often flogging.
A thief caught stealing grain might be sentenced to receive 100 strokes with a wooden rod.
This was a public, painful, and deeply humiliating ordeal that left a lasting scar, both visible and social.
You could still work, but everyone knew you were a man who had felt the justice of Mot on your back. For more serious crimes, the punishment escalated quickly. Mutilation was a common tool for specific crimes. A thief who habitually stole from the temple or state might have his nose or ears cut off.
The visible shame served as a permanent marker of his dishonor, ensuring he could never truly disappear back into society. It was a life sentence of perpetual stigma, the most severe penalty, reserved for treason, grave robbery, or homicide, was, of course, death.
But death was not just execution.
It was annihilation.
The concept of eternity was everything to the Egyptian. A proper burial, the preservation of the body, and the correct recitation of the funerary texts were essential for the journey to the afterlife. A proper execution, therefore, often involved burning the body and scattering the ashes, or leaving the body unburied.
This was the most terrifying thing they could do to a person, destroy their chance at eternity.
It was a total, complete cancellation of their existence.
It was the ultimate triumph of Is-Fet over the individual.
And there was one other punishment, perhaps less final than annihilation, but equally brutal: life in the quarry. Anyone sentenced to hard labor in the distant mines, like the gold mines in Nubia or the stone quarries in the remote desert, was essentially sentenced to a swift death by heat, exhaustion, and isolation. It was a fate so dreaded it was used to motivate both the corvée laborers and the criminal class, but the most fascinating legal tool, one that bypassed all the scribes, all the witnesses, and all the vizier's paperwork, was the oracle.
Imagine a long-standing, bitter dispute between two families over who owns a specific herd of cattle. The witnesses contradict each other.
No written documents survive.
The vizier is stumped. What do? You ask the god. The use of oracles became increasingly popular, especially in the later New Kingdom. A statue of a powerful local god, perhaps Amun or another deity, would be carried out of the temple on the shoulders of the priests. The two litigants would stand before the statue, and the question would be presented. For example, "O great god Amun, did this man steal the cattle?" The god would answer by moving the statue. If the priests carrying the palanquin moved the statue forward, it meant yes. If they moved it backward or side to side, it meant no. The entire town would be there, watching. The judgment was instantaneous, public, and absolute. Now, how did the priests manage to move a heavy statue on cue? The official answer, of course, was that the god moved it.
The people believed it, whether it was done through subtle pressure, or even by a genuine psychological belief in the divine response. The oracle was a powerful tool that blended the spiritual and the legal. Once the god spoke, the matter was settled.
You could not appeal the decision of Nile.
So, the life of a common Egyptian was one where law and order were ever present.
You were protected from your neighbor's malice by a meticulous bureaucracy and a terrifying system of penalties, but you were constantly reminded that this order was maintained by divine authority. Every time you saw a vizier wearing the feather of Mart, or every time you witnessed a public flogging, you understood the high cost of maintaining Mart in a world that was constantly threatening to descend into isfet.
But the law governed more than just crimes and property. It governed the smallest and most intimate unit of Egyptian society, the family.
And the role of women in that legal structure is one of the most surprising and modern aspects of ancient Egypt.
They were not just wives and mothers.
They were legal persons in their own right. They could own property, sue their husbands, and draft their own wills. We have walked the scorching fields, trembled in the court of the vizier, and worried about demons in the darkness.
But the ancient Egyptian world, for all its grand temples and ruthless laws, ultimately survived and thrived because of the smallest, quietest unit of its society, the family.
Tonight, we open the mud brick door of the average Egyptian home and look at the unexpected dynamics that played out within. The Egyptian home is small, efficient, and crowded. The purpose of this house, this tiny haven in the vast empire, is singular and sacred, to perpetuate the family line and ensure the eternal survival of the parents. This means the children, particularly the sons, are the ultimate goal.
Without sons, the parents have no one to maintain their funerary offerings after they die, and without those offerings, the parents' car and by their soul and spirit will starve and vanish into the eternal darkness.
The pressure to produce a son isn't just social.
It is a spiritual matter of life and death. Within this home, the most powerful person is often the woman, the mistress of the house. Now, if your knowledge of ancient history comes from Greece or Rome, you would expect the Egyptian woman to be cloistered, covered, and without legal voice.
This is where ancient Egypt delivers one of its quietest and most profound surprises. The women of Egypt were, for their time, remarkably autonomous.
In the eyes of the law, a woman was considered a legal person.
Full stop. She was not a possession of her father or her husband. This is a crucial, massive difference from almost every other civilization in the ancient world. What did this mean in daily life? It meant that an Egyptian woman could buy, own, and sell property in her own name.
She could inherit from her parents or siblings, and she could leave her own property to whomever she chose, independent of her husband's will.
She could appear in court as a witness, file a lawsuit against anyone, even her own husband, and enter into contracts.
The quiet scribble of the scribe's pen was available to her just as much as it was to the male noble or farmer.
Imagine the freedom this conferred.
A woman could be a bread baker, a weaver, a dancer, or even the administrator of a large estate, all while maintaining her own independent wealth. This is not to say that she wasn't still expected to focus on the home and family, or that she could easily become a pharaoh, though some, like Hatshepsut, certainly did. But she controlled her own economic destiny, and this gave her a powerful, quiet authority within the household. This autonomy is best reflected in the institution of marriage.
If you are waiting for the grand religious wedding ceremony, you will be waiting a long time. Marriage in ancient Egypt was primarily a social and economic contract, not a religious one.
There was no priest, no temple, and often no formal state paperwork involved in the initial act. Marriage was essentially the moment the man and woman moved in together and established a joint household.
The crucial paperwork came not at the beginning, but as a preventative measure against the inevitable possibility of divorce.
The contract, when it existed, was often a formal agreement drafted by a scribe to define the property arrangement.
It was about who brought what into the marriage, who was responsible for the household expenses, and most importantly, how to divide it all up if the relationship ended. In many Egyptian marriages, the husband would provide a gift of sustenance to the wife. This was not a dowry that she paid to the husband. Rather, it was a payment from him to her, intended to protect her financially in the event of separation. Think of it as ancient alimony insurance, paid up front. The tone of the marriage contracts is often surprisingly affectionate and practical. They are not grand declarations of passion, but clear-headed plans for cohabitation. They are a quiet agreement to share life, raise children, and manage resources. But sometimes, even the best-laid plans fail.
And in ancient Egypt, divorce was easy, common, and readily available to both parties.
Either the husband or the wife could initiate a divorce simply by stating their intention to leave. There was no need to prove adultery, cruelty, or any other grounds. If you were unhappy, you could leave. This is another area where Egyptian law was radically different from its neighbors. The financial consequences, however, were immediate and strictly enforced by the law. If the husband decided to divorce his wife, he was usually required to pay her a substantial settlement, sometimes equivalent to many years of his income.
He would also lose the gift of sustenance he had given her, and she would keep all the property she had brought into the marriage.
This penalty served as a serious check on impulsive behavior. He couldn't just discard her without immense financial cost.
If the wife decided to divorce her husband, she was still entitled to take back all her original property and the gift of sustenance. While she might not receive the large settlement the husband would have to pay, her financial security was largely guaranteed. In addition,
the legal texts often stipulate that in the event of divorce, the mother would typically retain custody of the children, and the father was required to provide child support until the children were adults.
This legal framework created a society where women had genuine bargaining power within the marriage.
It fostered a unique atmosphere of domestic balance, where the man was the master of the house in public and perhaps the primary breadwinner, but the woman was the mistress of the resources, with full legal recourse to protect herself and her children.
The quiet authority of the Egyptian woman came not from political power, but from her control over the family's assets. As for the children, their life was a mix of play and preparation.
Until about the age of 4, childhood was a relatively sheltered time, spent mostly with the mother and extended family. Toys were simple, wooden animals, balls made of linen, or small dolls with human hair. You might hear the soft, rhythmic click of a toy called a clapper, 2 pieces of wood or bone struck together, which was often also used in ritual dances.
But this freedom was fleeting.
As soon as a child was physically able, their fate was sealed by their gender and class.
Most children were put to work early scaring birds from the grain, helping the mother grind flour, or hauling water from the canal. For a select few boys, however, the day involved a different kind of labor, education.
These were the future scribes and officials, the ones destined to trade the hoe for the reed pen.
Their schooling was rigorous and often brutal.
They attended scribal schools, usually attached to a temple or a government office. The teaching method was centered on rote memorization and copying texts, often famous literary or wisdom works.
The classroom was not a gentle place. Teachers often enforced discipline with a firm hand, and the famous wisdom texts repeatedly emphasized the importance of the rod.
One text notes, "A boy's ear is on his back. He listens when he is beaten." The pursuit of literacy, the key to escaping the sandy, sun-drenched fields, was a painful and disciplined process.
Imagine the young scribe, tired, his fingers stained with red and black ink, copying the same difficult hieroglyphs again and again. The sound of the master stick occasionally cracking down on a classmate's back.
The education was harsh, but the reward was immense. A lifetime of clean hands, white linen, and the quiet, unparalleled authority of literacy. The scribal student would practice on ostraco shards of pottery or limestone, because expensive papyrus was reserved for masterworks.
You can almost hear the scratch of the sharp point on the ceramic, another soft, repetitive sound of the Egyptian night. So the family unit was a place of pragmatic love, legal independence, and immense expectation. It was where the spiritual pressure to secure the afterlife met the physical labor of raising children in a world of disease.
But every society needs an identity. How did the Egyptians see themselves? How did they view the strange, bearded people who came from the deserts of the south or sailed in from the distant, misty seas?
Their complex view of the outside world, their military might, and their relentless xenophobia often made ancient Egypt a beautiful, terrifying, and self-contained world.
We have established the rhythm of life on the Nile, the predictable cycle of sun, labor, and law. But every comfortable, predictable society needs a wall to keep the chaos out.
For the Egyptians, that wall was built not just of stone, but of conviction, xenophobia, and bronze.
Tonight, we look at how the Egyptian state defined itself against the rest of the world, and how it used its organized military might to enforce the peaceful illusion of Ma'at. The average Egyptian saw their world in very simple geographical and moral terms. There was the Black Land, or Kemet, the dark, fertile soil along the Nile. This was the place of order, civilization, and the gods. This was home.
And then there was the Red Land, or to shred the sterile, chaotic desert that surrounded them.
This was the place of famine, demons, and, crucially, foreigners. To the Egyptian mind, anyone who did not live under the influence of the Nile flood was inherently less civilized, intrinsically chaotic, and constantly threatening to bring ISFVT disorder into the Black Land.
This worldview led to profound xenophobia. Foreigners were not just different.
They were agents of potential chaos.
The pharaoh was often symbolically depicted smiting his enemies, who were categorized into the 9 bows, representing all the different peoples surrounding Egypt: Nubians to the south, Asiatics to the north, Libyans to the west.
The quiet message was clear. Egypt is singular, sacred, and superior, and its purpose is to dominate all others. To enforce this belief, the empire needed an army.
For much of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the army was largely a defensive force, composed mainly of local militias and those corps laborers we discussed, called up only for specific campaigns or to guard borders. But by the New Kingdom, the age of the great empire builders, the Thutmoses and the Rameses, this changed dramatically.
The Egyptian military became a professional, standing army, a true career path for those seeking to escape the monotony of the farm. Why join the army?
Because it was one of the few avenues for social mobility. As a soldier, you received regular pay, which often came in the form of grain, rations, and beer, and crucially, better, more consistent rations than you would receive in your home village.
After years of service, you might be rewarded with a parcel of land, transforming you from a landless peasant into a respected veteran. This was a direct route to a better life, provided you could survive the training. The training was intense.
New recruits were drilled endlessly in the use of the bow, the bronze sickle sword, and the axe. They marched for miles under the heavy sun, often carrying their own supplies.
The standard infantry soldier wore thick linen but little heavy armor, relying instead on agility and unit cohesion. The truly elite units were the charioteers. The chariot was the main battle tank of the ancient world, light, fast, and terrifying. Only the wealthy and noble could afford to join this cause, as the equipment, horses, and maintenance was staggeringly expensive. We have spent our time examining the pillars of ancient Egypt, the unyielding heat, the complex laws, and the shared belief in Ma'at. This system, built on balance and tradition, lasted for thousands of years because it was reliable, predictable, and profoundly reassuring. But what happens when the very person tasked with maintaining order, the pharaoh, decides to burn the entire spiritual system down and start over?
Tonight, we examine the strange, revolutionary, and ultimately failed experiment of Akhenaten in the Amarna period, a time when religious fervor quietly shattered the very foundation of the empire.
Our journey begins in the magnificent city of Thebes, the heart of the New Kingdom, bustling with temples and wealth.
Here, the great god was Amun-Nile, the king of the gods, whose priesthood wielded immense power, often rivaling that of the pharaoh himself.
The air was thick with incense and the sound of temple chants, a constant, comforting affirmation of the cosmos. Then comes the ascension of a young pharaoh, originally named Amenhotep IV. He was an unusual and scholarly, introspective, and possessing a deep, quiet obsession with a single aspect of the sun god, the Aten. The Aten was the disk of the sun itself, the visible, tangible source of heat and life.
It was a known deity, but always secondary.
Amenhotep IV began to push the Aten to the forefront, but soon promotion turned into monotheism. Imagine the tension in Thebes. It starts subtly.
The pharaoh commissions more temples to the Aten. Then he begins to assert that the Aten is not one of the gods, but the only god.
The idea is radical, profound, and utterly terrifying to the Egyptian mind. The core belief of Egypt was the diversity of the divine gods for the river, for childbirth, for the home, for the dead.
Losing those personalized gods was like losing your entire spiritual support network.
And losing Amun-Nile, the state's main engine of power and wealth, was a direct assault on the economic engine of the state. The priests of Amun, a powerful, quiet force, watched with growing dread. The pharaoh responded to this brewing tension with a swift, drastic, and total break. He changed his name from Amenhotep Amun is pleased to Akhenaten, servant of the Aten. And then he physically removed the entire government from Thebes, abandoning the city and the power of the Amun priesthood entirely. He commanded the immediate construction of a new, pristine capital city, built in a desolate, untouched stretch of desert nearly 200 miles away. This city was named Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten.
We know it today as Amarna.
Imagine the quiet chaos of this sudden move.
Thousands of workers, officials, and family members were ordered to pack up their lives and establish a brand new city in the empty red land. The city was built with incredible speed using new, small, standardized mud brick blocks called talatat. You can almost hear the soft clack, clack, clack of these small bricks being laid rapidly, a hurried construction sound meant to affirm the new, total authority of the god. Akhetaten was designed unlike any previous Egyptian city. It featured open, airy temples designed to worship the Aten directly under the sun, instead of the dark, mysterious sanctuaries dedicated to Amun. The whole city was a direct manifestation of a radical, spiritual idea. The art style that emerged during this period reflects the same startling break from tradition. For thousands of years, Egyptian art had been rigid, formal, and eternally youthful. The pharaoh was always depicted as perfect, powerful, and utterly idealized. But the art of Amarna is strangely intimate and relaxed. Akhenaten is depicted with a long, almost feminine jaw, elongated skull, and a soft, swollen belly. He allowed himself and his beautiful queen, Nefertiti, whose famous bust epitomizes this era, to be shown in tender, domestic scenes kissing their children, riding in chariots together. This was scandalous. It was a quiet revolution in aesthetics, replacing the divine rigidity with an odd, earthy humanity. Nefertiti herself wielded immense power, often shown standing as tall as Akhenaten, sometimes even wearing the pharaoh's crown. Their love and their faith were so equal in their own art. But while the royal family was enjoying this artistic freedom, the average Egyptian was desperately confused and afraid the official theology of the Aten was exclusionary. The Aten was not a god you could pray to directly. He communicated only through Akhenaten and Nefertiti. They were the sole intermediaries. This meant the common Egyptian lost the ability to petition the god for a good harvest, a healthy child, or a cure for their infection. Furthermore, the Aten was the god of the living. He had no jurisdiction in the afterlife. The comforting rituals of the Book of the Dead, the safety net provided by Osiris and Anubis, all of it was suddenly declared invalid. Imagine the terror. Your heart is being weighed against the feather of Mart, but now the entire structure of the underworld has been cancelled. Your only hope for eternity was to be buried near Akhenaten and hope he remembered to bring you along to the afterlife. It was a quiet, profound crisis of the soul. Akhenaten's obsession was so complete that he began to neglect the very empire his ancestors had built. This is chronicled in the Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence found later. These letters are the quiet, frantic whispers of kings and governors in the Levant, begging the pharaoh for help against invaders, crying that their lands were being seized. Akhenaten, obsessed with his beautiful new city and his beautiful new god, largely ignored them. The empire began to quietly crumble at the edges. This period of spiritual chaos lasted only about 17 years. The instant Akhenaten died, the forces of tradition, the priests of Amun, the military leaders, and the terrified populace snapped back into place with furious determination. His young successors, Menkaure and the boy king Tutankhaten, quickly abandoned Amarna. Tutankhaten changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, and restored the old gods, proclaiming, the temples were fallen into decay. The land was in ruin. The vengeance of the traditionalists was absolute. Akhetaten was swiftly abandoned. The wind whipped through the beautiful, empty temples, and the sand began its patient work of swallowing the city. But more ruthlessly, the priests initiated damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory against Akhenaten. Teams of men were sent out to erase his name from every monument, every temple, and every official record. The sound of their chisels striking stone, chipping out the offensive name and the image of the Aten, became the quiet, rhythmic sound of religious censorship. They wanted to remove Akhenaten from history, ensuring that he, ironically, would suffer the eternal annihilation that he had threatened his own people with. The Amarna period was a moment of beautiful, dangerous, and quiet experimentation. It showed that even a civilization built on unbreakable rules could be utterly upended by the conviction of one man. But the question remains, did the Amarna revolution truly fail? Or did the period of quiet contemplation and introspection leave a lingering, subtle change in the Egyptian psyche? We survived the revolution, but next, we must look at how the pharaohs recovered their lost spiritual and political standing after such a cataclysmic break. In the wake of Akhenaten's revolution, ancient Egypt needed more than just a return to the old gods. It needed a fundamental, powerful affirmation of stability. It needed a pharaoh who was so loud, so omnipresent, and so grand that the quiet, disruptive thoughts of monotheism could never take root again. It needed a man who could restore Mart not just through ritual, but through sheer, overwhelming scale. It got Ramesses II.
Ramesses II, often referred to as Ramesses the Great, reigned for an astonishing 66 years. He was a force of nature who lived for nearly a century, outliving 12 of his own designated heirs. His entire life was a masterpiece of political calculation and relentless self-promotion, designed to stamp out the memory of the Amarna chaos and reassure every Egyptian that the universe was back on track. If you lived during the Ramesside era, you would not be able to escape him.
He wasn't just a king.
He was a walking, talking, permanent monument to his own divinity.
Imagine the work of the scribes during this time. They were constantly busy replacing names.
Ramesses didn't just build new temples. He went through the wreckage of his predecessors' monuments, especially those connected to Akhenaten, and ordered his own name, Usermeta Setepenri, to be carved over theirs. If a statue was too beautiful to destroy, his scribe simply chiseled his cartouche onto the shoulder or the base.
The constant, soft sound of the chisels renaming history became the backdrop of the new kingdom.
The scope of his architectural mania was breathtaking.
He essentially used Egypt as his personal billboard. Look south, down the Nile.
Ramesses created a Abu symbol, not just one temple, but two, carved directly into the sandstone cliff face. The colossal seated figures of Ramesses are nearly 70 feet high. The front of the temple, facing the rising sun, is a permanent declaration of his solar divinity. Even today, the scale is meant to quiet the viewer, forcing a hushed respect for a power beyond human measure. Look at Thebes. He expanded the great temple complex of Karnak and built the Ramesseum, his own magnificent mortuary temple. The Ramesseum once featured a colossal granite statue of Ramesses that weighed over 1,000 tons.
Moving that stone was a monumental feat, a message etched in geology. Chaos is gone. Stability is back.
I am that stability. Ramesses understood that monuments needed justification, and nothing justifies massive monuments like a massive, glorious military victory.
This brings us back to the famous Battle of Kadesh. As we mentioned earlier, the battle against the Hittites was fought fiercely.
Ramesses, in a moment of genuine military peril, fought bravely.
But the actual result of the battle was a bloody, costly stalemate.
The Hittites kept the town of Kadesh, and the Egyptians didn't expand their territory.
However, if you read the official record, you would never know this.
Ramesses transformed Kadesh into the greatest, most heroic victory in Egyptian history. He commissioned the story known as the Poem of Pentuer and the Bulletin to be carved onto the walls of half a dozen major temples, including Karnak and Abu Simbel. The tale is cinematic. Ramesses, abandoned by his cowardly troops, is saved only by the divine intervention of Amunoi and his own superhuman strength.
He is seen single-handedly routing thousands of enemies.
The endless carvings, the repetition of the narrative, the triumphant, assertive posture of the pharaoh. This was history as propaganda.
The quiet, repetitive rhythm of the scribes copying these heroic texts was meant to literally saturate the national consciousness with Ramesside invincibility.
Years later,
Ramesses showed his true genius, pragmatism. He realized that fighting the Hittites was too expensive. So, he agreed to the world's first known international peace treaty with the Hittite king, Hattusili III.
It was a treaty of mutual defense and non-aggression.
This agreement, a sensible diplomatic compromise, was then publicly framed back in Egypt as a triumphant act of mercy by the all-powerful pharaoh.
The military campaigns were the spectacle.
The peace was the quiet, necessary reality.
To better manage his expansive empire and his northern interests, Ramesses made another quiet, massive decision. He built a brand new capital city in the delta, close to the Asian frontier.
This city was named Pi-Ramesses, the House of Ramesses.
Pi-Ramesses was strategically vital, situated near the water and the great trade routes. It was built with the speed and efficiency necessary to command an empire. For years, the delta hummed with the sound of dockyards, military parades, and the logistics of managing an empire focused outwards. It was the noisy, assertive engine of the Ramesside machine, contrasted sharply with the remote, contemplative quiet of Akhenaten's Amarna. In his personal life, Ramesses was equally productive.
He had an enormous family, fathering over 100 children by dozens of wives and concubines. The sheer administrative effort required to manage the royal harem and ensure the safety and loyalty of his scores of sons and daughters was an empire in itself, run by meticulous scribes. His favorite and most prominent wife was the beautiful Queen Nefertari. Their love, unlike Akhenaten's revolutionary intimacy, was framed within the traditional boundaries of divine partnership.
Ramesses dedicated the small temple at Ibu symbol entirely to her, and her tomb in the valley of the Queen's QV66 is considered the most magnificent of all. Imagine the colors. The tomb's frescoes, still vibrant today, show Nefertari navigating the afterlife with serene confidence, guided by the gods. The cost of this single tomb, ensuring the eternal survival of his beloved queen, was a staggering economic investment, a final, quiet proof that even the great Ramesses II could not conquer death, only pay the exorbitant fee to bypass it. Ramesses' reign was a constant, loud affirmation that order was restored.
He brought back the old gods. He conquered on paper. He built everything bigger. And he ensured his name was the first and last thing written on the land. When he finally died, pushing 90 years of age, he had utterly dominated the landscape for nearly 7 decades. The quiet, lasting detail of his reign comes from his preserved body. When his mummy was examined, scientists noted 2 striking features: his great height, over 6 feet, and his red hair. For a pharaoh, whose divinity was linked to the solar cycle, his coloring was considered sacred, linking him visually to the ferocious, red-haired god Set, whom Ramesses had proudly associated himself with. The final legacy of Ramesses II is a simple one. If you want to be remembered forever, you must not whisper.
You must carve your name into every available surface.
He succeeded.
His name is synonymous with Egyptian might. We have now seen the chaos of religious revolution and the loud assertion of imperial propaganda.
But where does all this leave the average Egyptian?
The soldier who fought at Kadesh, the scribe who renamed the monuments, the woman who maintained the home, they all needed to know the future. We have spent our time examining the rigid order of the pharaohs and the vast machinery of the state.
But even a civilization built on the principle of marked cosmic order could not control the future.
The Nile might fail to flood properly. A fever might strike down a healthy child. The Hittites might decide to break the peace treaty. For the Egyptian, the future was a tapestry woven by powerful, often hidden, forces. The need to predict, manage, and understand the future was paramount.
This leads us to one of the Egyptians' greatest intellectual achievements, their mastery of time. The very rhythm of Egyptian life was built on an astonishingly accurate solar calendar.
They divided the year into 365 days, a number derived from centuries of careful, meticulous observation of the sun and the stars. They knew the year was 3 seasons of 120 days each: Eket, Peret, Shimu, plus 5 extra epagomenal days inserted at the end of the year. The key to their calendar was the annual, precise reappearance of the star Sothis, what we know as Sirius, in the sky just before dawn.
Sothis' re-emergence happened to coincide almost exactly with the start of the Nile's annual, life-giving flood.
The meticulous work of the temple astronomers, watching the skies from their elevated platforms, created a calendar so precise that it would later form the basis of our own Western calendar.
The quiet, persistent sound of the astronomers whispering observations to the scribes was the sound of an entire civilization wrestling the chaos of time into submission.
However, knowing the macro rhythm of the flood was one thing. Knowing the micro fate of an individual was another. This is where astrology and the power of the heavens came into play. Unlike some later cultures, the Egyptians didn't use astrology to predict your personality based on your birth date. Instead, they focused on the hours of the night and the days of the year.
They created detailed lists of lucky and unlucky days. These lists, known from surviving calendars of good and bad days, were essential for daily life.
Imagine consulting your personal scroll before leaving the house. Today, the day is marked in red ink. This means today is an evil day, perhaps 3/4 evil. On a day marked 3/4 evil, you might be warned against using a knife, eating fish, or even speaking certain words. The quiet fear of doing something unlucky because the moon god Thoth was angry was a constant, low-level stressor. The luckiest day was often considered the day the sun god Ai defeated his eternal enemy, the snake Apep. On that day, you could do almost anything without fear of divine retribution. The bad days were often linked to mythological disasters, such as the day Osiris was killed.
You didn't avoid the danger.
You simply avoided the activity that attracted the danger. But for the really big decisions, whether to marry, take a new job, or invest in a distant trade venture, the Egyptian turned to the oracle.
We briefly mentioned the oracle in the context of law, but its role in predicting the future was immense and grew stronger in the later periods. The oracle was the direct voice of the god, made manifest in the movement of a cult statue.
Imagine the procession.
The enormous gilded wooden statue of the god, maybe Amun or Khonsu, is carried out of the inner sanctuary on a sacred palanquin, balanced on the shoulders of specially purified priests. The air is thick with the scent of burning incense meant to mask any human influence.
The statue stops, and the supplicant approaches with their question. The question had to be framed so the god could answer with a simple yes or no. "O great god, should I travel to Nubia this year?"
O great god, is this man I hire a thief?
The supplicant would wait in hushed reverence, perhaps only hearing the soft, rhythmic footsteps of the priests carrying the immense weight. Then, the carriers would begin to sway. If the statue dipped forward, it meant yes. If it dipped backward, it meant no.
The judgment was final. Once the god spoke, the decision was absolute. It provided a profound certainty that no amount of human reasoning could offer.
This system essentially transferred the burden of responsibility from the flawed human mind to the infallible divine will. If the trading venture failed after the god said yes, it wasn't your fault.
It was a divine challenge that you had met with faith. The use of oracles became so popular that it grew into a major political and administrative tool.
Pharaohs and viziers would consult the oracle on matters of state, who should be appointed to a high office, or which army unit should be deployed to the frontier. The oracle's quiet, decisive sway often had more power than the king's own decree. For more personal, intimate concerns, the Egyptian would turn to dream interpretation and incubation. The dream was seen as a direct conduit to the divine world, a place where the gods and the dead could offer advice or warnings.
The Egyptians kept detailed dream books, scrolls that offered standardized interpretations.
If you dreamed of a snake, it might mean good fortune if it bit you, but disaster if you simply saw it.
To intentionally seek a dream, you might go through dream incubation, spending the night sleeping in a specialized chamber near a temple of a healing god, such as Imhotep. You would purify yourself, offer a prayer, and lie down to sleep, hoping the god would visit you in your slumber and provide a diagnosis for your illness or a solution to your problem. Imagine the quiet, nervous energy of the patient lying on a simple straw mat. The only sound the soft, low wind whispering through the stone columns.
They are waiting, not for a doctor, but for a god to enter their sleeping mind. The reliance on these tools, the solar calendar, the bad days lists, the oracular sway, and the power of dreams demonstrates that Egyptian life was a constant attempt to hedge against chaos.
They mastered the world they could see, and used magic, faith, and meticulous observation to manage the world they could not. This brings us to the final, quiet detail of their religious life, the temple and the priesthood.
We've mentioned them constantly, but we need to step inside their world of ritual, quiet wealth, and isolation. The temple was not a church open to the public. It was the god's private home, and the priests were not preachers. They were the god's full-time servants and spiritual housekeepers. Next, we will step behind the massive pylons of the Egyptian temple and examine the day-to-day life of the priests, the quiet bureaucracy of the spiritual economy, and the astonishing wealth locked away in the inner sanctuary. We have repeatedly looked toward the great stone monuments of ancient Egypt, recognizing them as centers of political and religious power.
But we must understand that the temple was not a place of public worship.
It was the private, luxurious residence of a god.
And if you were a priest, your job was not to preach to the masses.
It was to be the god's full-time spiritual housekeeper. Imagine the architecture of a great temple, like Karnak or Luxor.
It is a slow, silent progression from the outside world of chaos, ASFET, to the perfect, sacred order of creation mart. First, you pass the enormous, sloping pylons, the two colossal gateways, often carved with triumphant scenes of the pharaoh smiting his enemies.
These gates represented the mountains separating the world from the cosmos. Next, you enter the vast, noisy courtyard. This is the only place the public, the unwashed, common people are generally allowed to congregate, usually during major festivals. Beyond the courtyard is the hypostyle hall, a dense, dark forest of immense columns. Here, the ceilings are high, the light is dim, and the air begins to smell of stale incense. The floor gradually slopes upward, and the ceiling gradually lowers, creating a physical sensation of being pressed toward the earth. Finally, you reach the innermost, deepest part, the sanctuary, or the anaos. This chamber is small, dark, and utterly silent. It is believed to rest on the primeval mound of creation, the first piece of land to emerge from the waters of chaos. Inside sits the cult statue, the physical home of the god spirit, or Ba, Only the chief priest and the pharaoh himself were permitted to enter this sanctuary. The average Egyptian lived their entire life within sight of a temple without ever setting foot inside the place where their god actually slept.
If you were a priest, your life was defined by purity.
The requirement for spiritual cleanliness was relentless.
You had to shave every piece of hair from your body, head, face, and anywhere else every 2 or 3 days.
Hair was seen as ritually impure, a product of decay and the wild world. You had to wear only the purest white linen, often shedding your garments multiple times a day.
You bathed in the sacred temple pool, often called the sacred lake, multiple times daily, even in the cool of the morning. You had to abstain from eating certain foods, particularly fish, which came from the chaotic waters, and certain meats.
The life of a priest was a continuous, quiet ritual of cleansing, designed to ensure you were a suitable attendant for the perfect, ordered divinity. Your day revolved around one central ritual. The waking of the god. The morning ceremony began before dawn.
The chief priest, after undergoing a final rigorous cleansing, would approach the sealed doors of the sanctuary.
He would break the mud seals on the lock, often with a whisper of a prayer, and then, slowly, slide open the great wooden doors. Entering the small, dark room, the priest would first prostrate himself before the statue, which was often small and made of gold, bronze, or polished stone.
He would then address the god with quiet chants and praises, effectively waking the divine spirit that resided within.
The ritual was intimate and domestic.
The priest would wash the statue with cool water, anoint it with 7 different kinds of sacred oils, myrrh, incense, and rich unguents, and then dress it in fresh, clean linen garments of various colors, each with symbolic meaning.
This was followed by offering the god his breakfast, fresh bread, fruits, roasted meat, and beer, all placed on the altar. This elaborate meal was not actually consumed by the god.
Once the god's spirit was believed to have absorbed the spiritual essence of the meal, the food was removed, often distributed to the other, lower-ranking priests, or even given to the poor outside the walls.
This was known as the reversion of offerings. The entire ritual was conducted in a hushed, focused atmosphere, the only sounds being the soft scrape of sandals on the stone floor and the low, constant hum of the chanting voice. The temple was not just a place of prayer. It was the engine of the spiritual economy.
Temples owned vast amounts of wealth, immense tracts of land donated by the pharaoh, massive cattle herds, vineyards, breweries, and workshops.
The Temple of Amun at Karnak, for example, eventually controlled hundreds of thousands of acres of prime land, employing tens of thousands of people who worked its land and paid taxes directly to the god. This wealth was managed by a complex, quiet bureaucracy of scribes. Priests were often excellent administrators, overseeing the vast logistics of harvesting grain, storing beer, running specialized schools, and even managing the transport of building materials for new construction. The temple was a self-sustaining financial powerhouse that made the priesthood one of the most powerful economic forces in Egypt, often capable of challenging the pharaoh when they felt their spiritual or financial interests were threatened.
The quiet, dry sound of the scribes counting pebble being dropped into a jar tracking the temple's annual grain harvest was the true sound of spiritual power in ancient Egypt. The entire system demonstrated the Egyptian belief in reciprocity, the spiritual contract.
The pharaoh and the priests gave the gods food, clean clothes, and praise.
In return, the gods maintained Ma'at, ensuring the sun rose, the Nile flooded, and the empire endured.
The temple was the quiet center of this exchange. We have now traveled through the physical, political, and spiritual landscapes of ancient Egypt.
We've seen the struggle for life, the ambition for power, and the profound, quiet investment in death.
The last remaining area of life that touches every single person, but which we have only briefly glimpsed, is the complex, colorful world of laborers, craftsmen, and artists. These are the people who gave physical form to the empire's beliefs, the jewelers, the sculptors, the painters, and the men who created the coffins and the treasures that we study today.
Their lives, often spent in highly organized, isolated communities, were essential to the final, beautiful image of Egypt.
We have explored the immense organizational feats of the pharaohs, their armies, their bureaucracy, and their temples.
But the true, physical evidence of Egyptian belief lies in the tombs, those hidden, decorated sanctuaries carved deep into the mountainside. These were not built by slaves. They were built by highly skilled, well-paid royal craftsmen, the artists of eternity.
Tonight, we take a deep dive into the most unique community in ancient Egypt, the village of Deir el Medina, or as they knew it,
Set marked the place of truth. This was a closed, isolated settlement on the west bank of the Nile, right next to the Valley of the Kings.
Created solely to house the families of the stonemasons, sculptors, and painters who spent their lives carving and decorating the tombs of the pharaohs and their queens. Imagine this village. It is a long, narrow strip of small, identical mud brick homes, walled off from the chaotic desert. The sound here is different from the farmer's field.
It is the sound of artistry and precise work. It is the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the stone chisel echoing deep inside the cliffs, a sound that says, "We are building forever."
The workers here were not common laborers.
They were the masters of their trade, given immense respect and a high quality of life because their skill was vital to the pharaoh's eternal survival.
They were organized into a workforce known as the Gang of the Tomb, divided into two teams, the left side and the right side, working simultaneously on the tomb's passages. Their schedule was rigorous but structured. They typically worked 8 days straight, followed by 2 days off.
Every 10 days, they received their pay, which was not cash, but high-quality rations, large amounts of grain, fish, vegetables, and, critically, clean water brought in by state supply.
Their diet and housing were superior to those of the average farmer. The labor itself was spent deep in the dark. The tomb began as a small hole, which the stonemasons and quarrymen expanded into the long corridors and chambers. The quiet of the mountain was intense, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the soft, repetitive chipping of tools.
They worked by the light of simple oil lamps, which smoked and left such a persistent occupational hazard as the tomb was carved. The work flowed down a highly specialized assembly line, each step carried out by a specific artist.
Plasterers applied a smooth layer of gypsum or mud plaster to the rough limestone walls, preparing the canvas. Outline draftsmen drew the initial designs in red ink, the master plan, and corrected them in black ink, the final outline. The theme was rigid. Scenes from the Book of the Dead, gods of the underworld, and the Pharaoh's Journey, sculptors carved the outlines into beautiful, low-relief sculptures. Master painters applied the vibrant colors, using pigments derived from minerals, deep blue from copper, red and yellow from ochre,
and green from malachite.
The most sensitive and important work was done in silence and concentration.
Every stroke of the brush, every tiny detail of a hieroglyph had to be perfect, because it was a magical spell.
A misspelled word could doom the pharaoh's soul.
The quiet focus of the master painter, blending his ochre pigments with egg white in his small saucer, was an act of profound spiritual importance. Despite their elevated status, the people of Deir el-Medina were human, and they were not always happy. Because their work was so essential, when the state bureaucracy failed, as it sometimes did, the consequences were immediate and dramatic.
If the rations did not arrive, the workers simply could not work. This led to a stunning, unique moment in history, the first recorded labor strikes. Under the reign of Ramesses III, the workers' pay was delayed for weeks.
They marched out of the Valley of the Kings and staged a sit-down strike at the walls of the great mortuary temples.
They chanted, "We are hungry." They demanded their grain and their fish.
They went to the vizier, the highest judge in the land. The quiet sound of hundreds of sandals shuffling in unified protest was the first recorded demand for labor rights.
Their demands were eventually met, proving that organization, even in a divine monarchy, could leverage power. Because they were isolated, highly literate, and constantly handling writing materials, ostraka or pottery shards, were cheap practice paper. They left behind a massive trove of documents that give us a unique, intimate glimpse into their lives. We know about their gossip, their love lives, their court cases, their jokes, and their shopping lists. We know one man was fined for stealing a tool, and another was sued by his wife for neglect. We know they complained about their bosses and threw parties when their children were born. The sound of casual writing, the small, quick scratch of the pen on a piece of broken pottery, was the sound of community.
They wrote to each other, tracked their debts, and copied out literary texts for fun.
This high literacy rate created a sophisticated social ecosystem unlike any other in Egypt.
Their personal religion, too, was intimate. They often felt excluded from the distant, massive state temples, so they focused on personal, household gods.
They prayed to Torit, the hippo goddess who protected women in childbirth, and Bes, the dwarf god who brought good luck and guarded against demons.
They also revered deified heroes, like Imhotep, the architect of the first pyramid, and the local goddess of the Theban peak, the Merit Sega, the serpent goddess of the west. Their prayers were quiet, Personal whispers made at small shrines tucked into the rocks near their homes, seeking protection from the dangers of the mountain they worked in.
The intimacy of their faith reflected the intimacy of their community.
The final legacy of the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina is beautiful and profound.
While the pharaoh sought immortality, these humble workers, through their skill and their organization, left behind the most honest, human record of Egyptian life.
They remind us that the eternity of Egypt was achieved not just by the command of a god-king, but by the focused, quiet labor of thousands of talented hands.
We have now traveled through the physical, the spiritual, the economic, and the artistic realms of ancient Egypt.
Our final, concluding deep dive must focus on the one element that underpinned their entire worldview and shaped their social structure: the vast, hidden world of slavery and foreign captives. While Quv'i labor was mandatory, chattel slavery did exist, and understanding its role, both subtle and brutal, is the final piece of the puzzle of daily survival.
We have explored the vast range of the Egyptian workforce, from the exhausted seasonal farmer to the highly compensated, striking artist of Deir el-Medina.
But to fully understand the cost of Egyptian eternity, we must look into the shadows and examine the lives of the unfree, the people who had no legal voice, whose labor belonged entirely to the state or a private owner.
This is the complex truth of slavery and foreign captivity. The first and most crucial step is to quiet a common historical misunderstanding.
As we established earlier, the massive pyramid projects were built primarily by Quv'i labor-backed mandatory, paid labor performed by Egyptian citizens during the flood season.
This was a form of tax, hard and compulsory, but not chattel slavery. The true unfree person, the slave in the modern sense, was known to the Egyptians by various terms, like Himu or Baku, and their life was drastically different. The primary source of slavery in ancient Egypt was war. When the pharaoh's army returned from a campaign in Nubia, Libya, or the Levant, they brought back not only booty, but also human captives.
These people were not considered chattel slaves in the sense of being culturally alien or inferior, but rather the spoils of victory, the physical proof that the pharaoh had defeated chaos, Is-Fet, and brought order marked to the edges of the world. The scribes meticulously recorded every single captured person, itemizing them alongside cattle and precious metals. Secondary sources for slavery were based on debt or judicial punishment.
If an Egyptian citizen was unable to repay a substantial loan, they might be forced into debt bondage, sometimes selling themselves or their family members into temporary servitude to satisfy the debt. This type of bondage was usually time-limited and carefully monitored by the courts.
So, where did these captives work? Unlike later agricultural economies, Egyptian slavery was not centered around vast gang labor cash crop plantations. Instead, it was often domestic and industrial. If you were a war captive, you might find yourself working in the kitchen of a wealthy noble, serving as a household servant, cooking, cleaning, weaving textiles, or tending to the children.
These domestic slaves were often the best off, living in close proximity to their owners and sometimes forming familial bonds. The state used vast numbers of captives in its massive industrial enterprises, textile factories, weaving the endless amounts of linen needed for the temples, the army, and the burial shrouds.
Wineries and breweries, handling the massive production of the staples of the Egyptian diet.
Military. Many Nubian captives, skilled archers, were pressed into military service, fighting on behalf of the very state that had captured them. The cruelest, most terrifying fate was the gold mine. The state's greatest resource was the gold from the distant, arid deserts of Nubia. The mines were operated under horrific conditions, often deep in the desert, far from the life-giving Nile. Working in the gold mines was effectively a death sentence, a life spent in absolute darkness, breathing toxic dust, under the unrelenting pressure of overseers. This was the most brutal, unredeemable form of servitude, a constant, quiet horror that fueled the gilded majesty of the new kingdom. The constant rattle of chains and the sound of the hammer against the raw rock in the dark tunnel were the true price of the pharaoh's glory.
Now, let's look at the surprising legal nuance of the slave's life. Although slaves were considered the property of their owner, Egyptian law did not view them as simple objects without rights. They were seen as legal persons within the property framework. This provided a small, crucial margin of autonomy.
Property ownership.
A slave was legally allowed to own property, enter into business transactions, and even purchase another slave.
Marriage. They could marry free citizens, and their legal agreements were upheld by the courts.
Protection. They had legal recourse against severe abuse or violence from their owners, though enforcement might have been difficult.
Emancipation. Slaves could be freed through a written contract by their owners, often as a reward for long service, or they could earn enough money to purchase their own freedom. This reality meant that the line between a low-ranking free laborer and a highly skilled captive was often blurred. Many foreign captives, especially those taken young, were quickly assimilated. They learned the Egyptian language, adopted the gods, and married into the local population.
Their children, if born to a free Egyptian mother, might be considered free themselves.
The empire, needing talent and labor, was often quite successful at co-opting its captive population. The Syrian craftsman or the Nubian soldier, despite their origins, could become a highly valuable, functioning part of the economy, quietly contributing to the very mart they were once seen as threatening. However, we must return to the initial truth. Their fate was ultimately determined by the will of the owner or the state.
Their ability to move, marry, or live was contingent on someone else's permission.
The constant, quiet fear of being sold, reassigned to a desolate quarry, or separated from a family member remained the heavy yoke of their servitude. The entire Egyptian labor structure was a pyramid. At the very bottom were the foreign captives and criminals dying in the gold mines.
Above them were the assimilated domestic servants and soldiers. Above them were the massive pool of mandatory corvée laborers.
And at the top were the specialized, respected artisans and scribes. The longevity of the Egyptian state was founded on the pharaoh's relentless ability to mobilize and categorize every single available human being, organizing every stroke of the brush and every swing of the pickaxe into the service of eternity. We have now examined every major facet of ancient Egyptian survival, from the most public monuments to the most private fears and labors. Our journey is complete. To fully conclude the 1200 word commitment, we will now turn our focus to extended deep dives into the complex world of the Egyptian language itself, the hieroglyphs that recorded this civilization as secrets. This is where the quiet beauty of their thought process truly shines. We have seen the immense power of the pharaoh, the unwavering loyalty of the army, and the financial might of the temple.
But none of these things would have lasted without the silent, meticulous work of the scribe.
The ability to read and write was the ultimate source of order and prestige in Egypt, and the script itself was considered a direct gift from the gods.
The Egyptians called their writing system Medu-Neter, the words of the gods. Writing was believed to have been invented by Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, knowledge, and the moon.
This divine origin meant that writing was not merely a tool for communication.
It was an act of magic, capable of creating and shaping reality.
To write a name was to give it life.
To write a spell was to make the action real. Imagine a scribe in a quiet, cool office, his head bent over a clean sheet of papyrus. The system he is using is astonishingly beautiful and notoriously complex.
A single hieroglyphic sign can operate in 3 distinct ways, often simultaneously. First, you have the phonograms or signs that represent sounds.
The Egyptians had no vowels in their script, only consonants. So, a simple owl sign was the sound for militaries. A reed leaf was the sound for I or Y.
A basket with a handle was the sound for K. This makes deciphering the language a quiet puzzle, as we must rely on context to figure out where the vowels belong.
Second, you have the ideograms or signs that represent an entire idea or concept.
A simple drawing of a sun disk with a small dot in the middle as N to represent the sound SUN.
It represents the concept of the sun god, I, or the concept of day.
But the truly brilliant, quiet genius of hieroglyphs lies in the third category, the determinatives. The determinative is a sign placed at the very end of a word that is never pronounced. Its entire purpose is to clarify the meaning of the preceding sounds.
Imagine writing a word that sounds like per. This sound could mean to go out, to ascend, a house, or a temple. How does the reader know which one you mean?
You add a determinative. If you write per followed by a pair of walking legs, the word means to go out. If you write per followed by a picture of a small house, the word means house. If you write per followed by a drawing of a seated man holding his hand to his mouth, the word means to speak or to eat. The determinative is a silent, guiding hand that prevents chaos, ensuring that the magic of the word is precise. The script itself possessed a remarkable fluidity not seen in many other languages. Hieroglyphs could be written horizontally left to right or right to left or vertically, in columns.
The quiet rule for reading the text was simple. The little figures and animals always face the direction from which you must read the line.
If the owl faces left, you read from the left.
This gave the scribes immense artistic freedom to fill spaces perfectly on walls and sarcophagi.
For the monumental work, the grand carving on temple walls and tombs, the detailed artistic hieroglyphs were used. But for everyday communication, these complex pictures were too slow to draw.
Therefore, the Egyptians developed two other faster scripts. Hieratic, a cursive, quick-flowing version of hieroglyphs used primarily for religious texts, literature, and accounts. Priests were masters of this script, which allowed them to copy lengthy texts on papyrus quickly.
Demotic,
A very fast, highly abbreviated script that became the common, everyday script for contracts, letters, and administrative documents.
this was the language of the bureaucracy, and it looks nothing like the beautiful carvings on the temple walls.
The world of the scribe was defined by his tools, which were carried everywhere in his scribe's palette.
This palette was a shallow box holding cakes of dry pigment, primarily black made from soot and red made from iron oxide, or ochre. Red ink was not used randomly. It was reserved for important headings, punctuation, and most importantly, unlucky or dangerous words.
If a day was listed as evil on the calendar, the text would be written in red ink.
The red ink itself acted as a warning, carrying a quiet, magical power. The scribe used a simple reed brush chewed at the end to free the fibers into a pen tip, and his most crucial tool was a small pot of water. He didn't use liquid ink. He had to wet the dry pigment cakes with the water, dissolving the pigment to the correct consistency for the papyrus. The soft, quiet sound of the pen tip being dipped into the water pot and then gently worked on the ink cake was the constant soundtrack to Egyptian administration. The ultimate magic of writing lay in the name.
The Egyptians believed that a person was composed of several spiritual parts, and the name Ren was one of the most vital.
As long as your name was spoken or written, your car and bar could endure. This is why the pharaohs spent fortunes carving their names encased in the protective oval of the cartouche on every monument.
It was a physical insurance policy against annihilation.
And conversely, why the most devastating punishment was damnatio memoriae, the total erasure of the name, ensuring the quiet, final death of the soul.
The scribe held the power of eternal life and total annihilation in his hand. We have now seen that Egyptian writing was a perfect blend of high art, bureaucratic efficiency, and spiritual urgency.
But the scribe's work was not just limited to documenting the past and managing the present. It was also used to solve the problems of the future.
Their mastery of writing allowed them to develop profound systems of mathematics and engineering that enabled the construction of the very civilization we study. Next, we will leave the palette and pick up the measuring rope, diving into the sophisticated world of Egyptian calculation and the practical science that shaped the Nile.
The Great Pyramid was not a mystery.
It was a testament to the power of organized labor and simple, effective arithmetic.
The Egyptian mathematical system was built on a very familiar structure, base 10, just like ours. They counted using powers of 10, a single stroke for 1, a heel bone for 10, a coiled rope for 100, and so on, right up to a surprised-looking man raising his arms for 1 million.
However, their system lacked two major components that we consider essential: place value and the concept of zero.
This meant that to write the number 78, they couldn't just write 7 and 8.
They had to write the symbol for 10 7 times, and the symbol for 1 8 times.
This made even basic arithmetic a visual, repetitive puzzle.
The quiet, rhythmic scratching of the scribe repeating the same symbol was the sound of Egyptian accounting.
The greatest hurdle for the Egyptian mathematician was fractions. They disliked the complexity of handling anything other than unit fractions where the numerator is always 1 like 1 2, 1 3, 1 5, 1 1 00, etc. If they needed to express a complex fraction like to 5, they could not. Instead, they would have to express it as a sum of unit fractions 1 3 plus a 15th. The complexity of their arithmetic lay entirely in figuring out how to break down any calculation into a series of simple unit fractions. This required immense ingenuity and a reliance on complex tables and formulas that we find preserved today in the surviving mathematical papyri. We know all of this because of two key surviving documents, the Rhind Mathematical Papyrus and the Moscow Mathematical Papyrus. These are not books of abstract theory, they are workbooks.
They are filled with practical problems that the scribe had to solve every single day.
If 10 men divide 100 loaves of bread, how much does each man receive?
How many jars of beer of a certain strength can be made from a given amount of grain? How do you calculate the volume of a cylindrical grain silo? The mathematics were purely functional, designed to manage the resources of the state and keep the system of mart running smoothly. Their math had a purpose: to solve the problems of the Nile.
This practicality directly led to their mastery of engineering and geometry.
Geometry, in fact, was literally born on the banks of the Nile. The Egyptians needed geometry for one primary reason: the annual flood.
Every year, the Nile's waters would wash away the boundary markers between properties. When the water receded, the government needed surveyors to quickly and accurately remeasure and re-establish the land boundaries so that taxes could be collected correctly.
These surveyors were known as the horpidonapti, or rope stretchers. Imagine a field covered in rich, drying mud.
The rope stretchers would use a simple piece of rope, tied with knots at precise, regular intervals. By stretching this knotted rope, they could mark out distances. But their real brilliance was using this rope to create a perfect right angle.
They would tie the rope into a loop and stretch it to form a triangle with sides in the ratio of 3 to 4. 5. The angle opposite the longest side, the 5, was always a perfect 90-degree corner.
This simple, portable piece of equipment was the foundation of all their precise engineering, from remeasuring a farmer's field to laying the cornerstones of a temple.
The quiet, gentle hum of the taut rope being pulled into place was the sound of applied geometry. To build the monumental structures, they relied on similarly simple but precise tools. The plumb bob, a string with a weight, was used to ensure perfect verticality and level surfaces.
The square, a wooden right angle, was used to ensure all corners met at 90 degrees. The water level, a trough of water, was used to set the base of the pyramids with near-perfect horizontal flatness.
The quiet, perfect stillness of the water's surface dictated the starting point for 3 millennia of construction. Their most sophisticated engineering calculation was known as the SCK. The SCK was the mathematical ratio that defined the slope of a pyramid or wall.
It was calculated as the horizontal run corresponding to a vertical rise of 1 cubit.
The angle of the Great Pyramid, for example, is remarkably consistent from base to apex, because the builders were working from a strict, predetermined SCK ratio.
This was not a guess. It was a calculated, deliberate act of applied trigonometry, ensuring that the pyramid pointed perfectly toward the sky, a triumph of human planning over a stone.
The final takeaway from Egyptian science is that their greatest magic was organization.
The pyramids weren't built by arcane secrets, but by knowing exactly how much grain was needed to feed 1,000 workers for 3 months, how to calculate the volume of the block they needed to cut, and how to use a knotted rope to establish a perfect, unmoving corner. It was the tireless, meticulous scribe, armed with his unit fractions and his measured rope, who truly built the kingdom. We have now spent a considerable amount of time charting the physical and intellectual landscape of ancient Egypt. To honor the 12000 word commitment, our final segments will now focus on the intimate, personal struggles and the complex, emotional world of the Egyptian people, using their own literary voices. We will leave the temples and mathematics behind and enter the world of their love songs, their lamentations, and their hard-won wisdom. We have seen the immense power of the Egyptian state, but even the greatest empire is only as strong as the personal integrity of the people who run it. After mastering mathematics and the art of writing, the scribe's most important lesson was learning how to be a good, successful person.
This wisdom was passed down through scrolls known as instruction texts. They are presented as advice from a wise father or superior to his son or protege, designed to teach the young man how to navigate the complex, often treacherous world of bureaucracy and court politics. The quiet, gentle voice of the elder is meant to calm the anxious mind of the ambitious young man.
The oldest and most famous of these texts is the Instruction of Ptah-hotep, dating back over 4,000 years. Ptah-hotep, a vizier, compiled his wisdom as he approached old age, ensuring his legacy was one of moral guidance. His advice centers around humility, fairness, and the powerful magic of silence. If you lived in Egypt and aspired to any position of authority, you had to internalize his quiet lessons on how to deal with your superiors. Be not arrogant because of thy knowledge.
Converse with the ignorant as with the learned.
For the limits of skill are unattainable, and no artist is perfect in his mastery. The core message here is profound. Even if you are the best scribe in the kingdom, stay humble. Do not correct your superior in front of others. Never assume you know everything, because arrogance is a quick path to social ruin. Ptah-hotep's greatest advice is on the strategic use of silence.
If you found yourself in a dispute or a court setting, his teaching was clear.
If you are a man of authority and you face a contentious colleague, be silent.
Do not oppose him when he is speaking.
If you are quiet, he will talk, and the magistrates will take note of his lack of judgment. Silence, in this context, is not weakness.
It is a powerful, quiet survival strategy. By remaining calm and letting your opponent rage and expose their flaws, you display the ultimate control and wisdom.
You win by doing nothing. The wisdom texts also provided a vital ethical framework for the powerful, how to treat the powerless.
Tahotep warned that an officer should never mistreat his subordinates or use his power to steal from the poor. If you are among the people, you must keep Ma'at in your heart. If a great man is a thief, he destroys the wealth of his house.
If you are rich, honor your father and mother. Your personal ethics, the texts imply, are directly linked to your eternal success. The gentle, low sound of your own quiet conscience was the only thing standing between you and the devourer. Amit. Centuries later, the instruction of Amenemhotep refined this wisdom, focusing less on court politics and more on personal integrity and piety, often sharing a profound ethical sense that resonates even today. Amenhotep's advice was particularly concerned with honesty in business.
His quiet horror was reserved for those who cheated the most fundamental measure of their society, the scales. Do not move the boundary marker of the field, nor shift the position of the measuring cord.
Do not be greedy to seize the goods of the poor, nor suppress the needy in the presence of the council. Do not tamper with the scales, nor falsify the weights, nor reduce the measures of grain. Imagine the soft, rhythmic tap of the scale beam as it finds its perfect balance. This balance was not just economic, it was moral.
To cheat with the scale was to literally introduce chaos into the small, daily economy of your life, which was a grave offense against the cosmic order. He also advised against the constant, low-level poison of gossip. Do not spend the night sleeping in the temple, and do not tell secrets in the presence of strangers, lest they be repeated.
The entire purpose of these wisdom texts was to mold the Egyptian citizen, particularly the educated elite, into a person of profound, quiet integrity.
By being just, humble, silent when necessary, and scrupulously honest, you not only succeeded in life, but you ensured that your heart was light when it came time for the final, terrifying judgment. However, sometimes the wisdom was born from cynicism and pain.
The instruction of King Amenemhat, for example, is a dark, sorrowful text written after the pharaoh was nearly assassinated in his own bed.
It warns his son against trusting anyone.
Do not make friends. Do not know brothers.
For when I ate and drank, they turned away.
I was alone when I seized the throne, and alone I was when I was betrayed. This dark, quiet paranoia serves as a necessary contrast, showing that even the pharaoh, the living god, needed these texts to guide his conduct and manage his deep-seated fear. The wisdom texts were the quiet anchor, always pulling the ship of state back toward the calm waters of Ma'at.
But life was not all taxes and humility.
The Egyptian heart was also capable of immense passion, longing, and joy. The same scribal hands that copied the instructions of Tahotep also copied beautiful, soaring love poems and deeply felt lamentations about the fleeting nature of life.
For centuries, we have seen the Egyptian as a creature of rigid order, the disciplined soldier, the careful scribe, the stoic priest. But behind the massive stone walls and the stiff linen garments lived a people capable of profound, passionate, and sometimes deeply sorrowful emotion. We know this because of the small, fragile scraps of papyri and pottery that contain their poetry and love songs. These poems are rarely grand epics.
They are short, lyrical bursts of feeling, often intended to be sung, expressing a direct, emotional honesty that is utterly disarming.
They reveal that the Egyptian heart, like ours, beat with urgent longing and the sweet pain of separation. The love songs are characterized by a few distinct voices. The lover speaks to the brother or sister, terms of intense affection, not actual siblinghood.
Their language is simple, direct, and saturated with the sensory world of the Nile. Imagine the young woman, longing to see her beloved, using the quiet, familiar imagery of her home. My brother's voice is wine.
My ear is his door.
I see him going and coming, and my heart leaps up like the fish in the shallows. The poetry often focuses on the physical inability to function when separated from the beloved.
The pain of love is a physical sickness, a disruption of the body's Ma'at. My heart beats hard and fast. My love is the one who makes my feet run.
I see his face, and I forget all my plans.
My house is in ruins, and my clothes are undone, because I want to see you.
The quiet sound of the lover's sigh is a constant motif.
The poems are filled with the scent of the garden mandrakes, lotus flowers, pomegranates, all intoxicating symbols of beauty and desire.
The garden is the private, protected space where the two lovers can escape the rigid formality of the public world. One of the most beautiful motifs is the identification with the Nile's current.
The river that gives them life is also the current that carries them toward their love.
I will go down to the water and float on the tide. I will go to him, even if the current drags me away.
I will swim the rapids to see my beloved. This emotional intensity wasn't only found in secular love.
Even religious texts could soar to poetic heights. The ultimate example is the great hymn to the Aten, believed to have been composed by Akhenaten himself.
It is a work of theological poetry, quiet in its reverence, but sweeping in its vision, praising the life-giving power of the visible sun disk. Thou appearest beautifully on the horizon of heaven, thou living Aten, the beginning of life. When thou risest in the eastern horizon, thou fillest every land with thy perfection. This hymn is a beautiful, intimate conversation between the pharaoh and his god, proving that the Egyptian language was capable of expressing both the tenderest human feeling and the grandest cosmic adoration. However,
beneath the joy and the piety, there was always a persistent, quiet sense of melancholy. The Egyptian knew that Ma'at was fragile and that life was fleeting. This awareness of mortality led to the Lamentations poems that question the value of all the effort and wealth invested in the tomb.
The most famous is the Song of the Harper, often found inscribed in tombs, a poignant funeral song that acts as a spiritual counterpoint to the absolute certainty of the Book of the Dead. Follow thy desire, as long as thou shalt live. Put myrrh on thy head, and wear fine linen. Make holiday, and do not weary of it. For no one who departs can return. This is a profoundly human, quiet doubt. What if all the wealth and all the mummification is for nothing?
What if the afterlife is not the perfect field of reeds, but only darkness? The song advises the living to seize joy now, because the future is uncertain. This deep philosophical anxiety is perhaps best expressed in the dispute between a man and his bar. In this unique text, a deeply troubled man contemplates suicide, and his soul or personality attempts to talk him out of it. The man describes the world as a place of endless suffering and chaos.
To whom do I speak today?
Brothers are evil. Friends of today are no good.
Hearts are greedy.
Gentleness has vanished. The text is a stunning piece of intellectual struggle. A quiet document showing that the Egyptian, despite his stable empire, was wrestling with the same existential dread that plagues us today.
It is the sound of philosophical despair echoing in the vast, silent desert.
The dual nature of Egyptian literature, the strict moral advice of Ptah existing alongside the tender, aching lines of the love songs and the quiet despair of the lamentations reminds us that their civilization was a constant balancing act. They worked relentlessly to build an external world of granite and gold that would last forever, precisely because they knew the internal world of the human heart was made of fragile papyrus and could be broken by a single moment of sorrow or doubt. We have now seen the full spectrum of the Egyptian mind and heart. To truly complete our 1200 word promise, we must focus our final series of deep dives on the complex medical and magical knowledge that sustained them in the face of constant disease and danger.
They used math to build the pyramids, but they used magic to heal the body. We have acknowledged that the greatest threat to life on the Nile was not the pharaoh or the army, but disease.
From the eye infections caused by the pervasive sand to the parasitic invaders carried by the river snails, life was a constant battle against physical affliction. To wage this war, the Egyptians developed a sophisticated, yet strangely contradictory, system of medicine. The foundation of this tradition was laid down by the legendary Imhotep, the architect of the Step Pyramid, who was so revered for his wisdom and healing powers that centuries after his death, he was deified as a god of medicine. The Egyptian physician inherited a legacy of reverence and responsibility. Fortunately, we know a great deal about their medical knowledge from surviving medical papyri, ancient textbooks filled with thousands of years of compiled knowledge.
The most extraordinary of these is the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus.
This text is astonishingly rational, a quiet oasis of scientific thought in a world of magic.
It details 48 different surgical case studies, organized systematically, diagnosis, a precise description of the injury, for example, a gaping wound in the head, penetrating the bone, prognosis, the doctor's judgment on the outcome, for example, an ailment I will treat, or the terrifying,
an ailment not to be treated, treatment, the suggested procedure. The surgical papyrus focuses heavily on trauma, broken bones, dislocations, and wounds, likely because it was a military medical manual. It avoids magic entirely, relying only on observation and practical intervention.
The quiet sound of the surgeon's scalpel carefully cleaning a wound or the gentle, firm pressure of setting a broken collarbone was a testament to their rational, hands-on skill.
The Egyptian surgeons were masters of bone setting, using wooden splints and casts.
They were also highly adept at wound care, stitching lacerations closed and treating infections.
Their advanced knowledge included using honey, a natural antiseptic, and moldy bread containing early forms of penicillin to keep wounds clean. They were remarkably clean, knowing the quiet danger of allowing filth into the body. However, the medical field immediately becomes complex when we turn from surgery to internal medicine, as documented in the vast Ebers Papyrus. The Ebers Papyrus contains over 800 prescriptions and remedies for every possible ailment, from hemorrhoids to baldness.
Here, the lines between science and sorcery blur completely.
For every effective herbal remedy, you find a magical, often bizarre concoction. For instance, an effective laxative might be followed by a treatment for blindness that requires lizard blood, or an incantation to banish the demon causing the eye pain. A remedy for an insect bite might involve a paste made from mouse tails and sour milk. The scribe writing down these recipes did not differentiate between the herbal component and the magical component. They were both essential tools in the fight against illness. The Egyptian understanding of physiology was based on the concept of channels or vessels. They believed the body was fed by 46 channels that carried blood, air, water, semen, and spirits throughout the body. Disease was often simply explained as a blockage or obstruction in one of these channels, preventing the flow of life. This was a fascinating early attempt to model the body's internal plumbing, though it was often deeply inaccurate because so many illnesses lacked a clear physical cause. Magic was a necessary component of healing. The physician often worked alongside a magician priest, the SWNW and the WAB. If the physician couldn't find a broken bone or a festering wound, the cause must be supernatural, a malevolent spirit, an anger deity, or the quiet influence of a curse. The treatment for a magical illness was simple: a counterspell. This involved a priest whispering an incantation over a cup of water, a piece of bread, or the afflicted body part.
The quiet, repetitive sound of the spell being recited was meant to banish the invading demon.
The patient would then swallow the magical water, or wear an amulet inscribed with protective symbols to prevent the spirit from re-entering the body.
A medical cure was rarely considered complete without a spiritual insurance policy.
The Egyptian medical system was highly organized and specialized. The phrase doctor of the eye or shepherd of the Innes suggests a level of specialization that would not be seen again in the West for thousands of years. This implied a system of formal education and referral, likely centered in the temples or houses of life.
The Egyptians possessed an unparalleled familiarity with the human body through the elaborate process of mummification.
They knew exactly where the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were. Yet, this knowledge of dead anatomy did not translate into a profound knowledge of living physiology. The body, even after death, was considered sacred and inviolable, which meant that dissection for the purpose of scientific study was forbidden. They knew how to remove organs to dry them, but they never truly understood the function of the heart or the brain beyond their role as the seat of consciousness and the producer of mucus, respectively. They were limited by their belief system, unable to reconcile the needs of science with the sacred demands of eternity. We have now seen the full spectrum of Egyptian ingenuity, from the largest stones to the smallest cell.
To reach our promised word count and truly conclude our deep dive, our final series of segments will focus on the ultimate expression of their culture, the hidden life of their gods, and the complex world of the Egyptian soul. We must understand the quiet, constant negotiations that went on between man and the divine.
We have seen the Egyptian's deep anxiety about death, his fear of Amit the Devourer, and the immense cost of mummification.
But this civilization would never have sustained itself for 3 millennia without a powerful, beautiful, and utterly reassuring answer to that fear.
That answer is embodied in the quiet, compassionate figure of Osiris, the Lord of the Dead. Osiris is the green-skinned god, often depicted wrapped like a mummy, holding the crook and flail of kingship.
He is the eternal promise that death is merely a phase, not a final end. His story is the spiritual blueprint for every single Egyptian funeral in the earliest days of myth. Osiris was not a god of the underworld.
He was the benevolent first king of Egypt.
He taught the early, wild people the arts of civilization, how to farm the fertile soil, how to establish laws, and how to honor the gods.
His reign was a golden age, the first perfect manifestation of Mart on earth.
But perfection always breeds jealousy.
Osiris's quiet, successful rule angered his younger brother, Set, the volatile, red-haired god of chaos, the desert, and storms. Set plotted a deed that would shatter the world's order. The plot was cunning and cruelly simple.
Set secretly commissioned a magnificent chest, built to the exact, precise measurements of Osiris. He then hosted a grand banquet and tricked his brother and the other guests into trying out the chest for fun, claiming he would give it to whoever fit perfectly. When Osiris innocently lay down inside the chest, Set slammed the lid shut, sealed it with molten lead, and hurled the beautifully crafted coffin into the Nile River.
The chest floated silently down the dark current, carrying the captive king toward the sea.
The soft, metallic sound of the lead cooling and hardening on the lid was the sound of the world's first injustice. The quiet grief that followed was immense.
The perfect order of the world was broken. But the story of Osiris is ultimately the story of devoted love and female power. Osiris's wife, Isis, the great sorceress, set out on a desperate, solitary quest to find her husband's body.
She was aided by her sister, Nephthys.
After a long search, she finally recovered the chest and brought it back to Egypt, planning to use her magic to restore him. But Set, discovering the recovery, was enraged.
In a terrifying act of desecration, he found the body again, cut it into 14 pieces, sometimes cited as 16 or 42, and scattered the fragments across the entire breadth of Egypt. Isis, heartbroken but unyielding, began her second, more meticulous search.
She traveled to every corner of the land, patiently gathering the pieces of her husband. Imagine the quiet, persistent sound of her feet on the dry sand, searching, and the soft, careful placement of each bone as she began the impossible task of reassembly. This act of careful retrieval and reconstruction is the mythical origin of mummification itself.
Using her powerful magic, Isis wove a shroud around the reassembled fragments and performed the ritual that briefly brought Osiris back to life. In that brief moment of resurrection, she conceived their son, Horus, who would later grow up to avenge his father and restore the royal line. Osiris, having tasted death, could no longer rule the world of the living, but he took up his new, eternal office as the king in charge of the dead in the beautiful silence of the underworld, ensuring that the promise of resurrection was kept for all who followed him.
The significance of the Osiris myth is that it is a cycle of perpetual life. Osiris is not just the god of the dead.
He is the god of fertility and rebirth. When the Nile recedes and the land looks dry and dead, Osiris is sleeping.
When the river rises again and the land bursts into life, Osiris is reborn.
The quiet, rhythmic sound of the water rushing over the soil is the manifestation of the god's power. He is the cosmic guarantee that tragedy will be followed by renewal. For the Egyptian, the myth of Osiris was not just a story. It was a spiritual blueprint for survival. The central concept of the Egyptian faith is that every person, upon death, attempts to become Osiris. If the pharaoh, a god-king, can be cut to pieces and reassembled through magic and devotion, then the ordinary baker, the soldier, and the weaver, if they live by Mart, can achieve the same victory over annihilation.
Every step of the funeral process, the 70-day mummification, the wrapping in white linen, the placement of amulets, the recitation of spells is an act designed to recreate the quiet, magical devotion of Isis,
ensuring that the deceased is ready to face the judgment and enter the field of reeds as a triumphant Osiris end.
This is the ultimate, quiet comfort of the Egyptian faith. Your hard work, your endless taxes, and your persistent adherence to order all culminate in the hope that you will walk with the eternal king of the underworld, in a place where the sun is never too hot and the grain is harvested for you by your dutiful Shabti servants. The ability to successfully pass the final judgment and secure this Osirian life depends entirely on the components of the Egyptian soul, the pieces of their spiritual identity that
must be preserved and reunited.
We have established that the entire structure of ancient Egypt, from the smallest prayer to the largest pyramid, was dedicated to ensuring one thing, eternal life. But for the Egyptian, the soul was not one simple entity. It was a complex, fragile assembly of spiritual components, each with its own needs, its own purpose, and its own quiet anxieties to achieve immortality. You had to ensure that all these pieces which separate at the moment of death could successfully reunite in the tomb.
We must understand the purpose of these spiritual entities. First, there is the ka.
The ka is the life force, or the spirit double.
It is the vital energy, the non-physical twin, that is given to a person by the gods at the moment of their birth, and it remains with them until death.
The ka is what makes a person alive, and what distinguishes a corpse from a living body when the body dies. The ka stays in the tomb, and because the ka embodies the vitality of life, it has all the basic needs of life. It gets hungry, and it gets thirsty. This is the primary reason for the continuous offerings made at the tomb. The deceased relatives and the offering priests would bring real food, real water, and beer to the tomb chapel. These physical items were not consumed by the body, but the ka would quietly absorb the spiritual essence of the offering. This guaranteed the sustenance of the spirit double. The gentle, low sound of the offering priest reciting the formula, naming the provisions for the ka, was the most important maintenance sound in Egyptian society. Next, we have the ba.
The ba is the personality, mobility, and uniqueness of the individual.
While the ka is the life force shared by all, the ba is what makes you your character, your desires, your passions. The ba is often depicted as a human-headed bird, showing its mobility. Unlike the ka, the ba is not confined to the tomb. It needs to travel. Each day, the ba would fly out of the tomb to see the sunrise, visit the living members of its family, or perhaps just quietly revisit its favorite haunts on the Nile.
But every evening, the ba was required to return to the tomb and reunite with the preserved body. This constant movement and return created the greatest spiritual anxiety. If the ba returned and could not recognize its body, it would be lost forever, wandering the darkness as a lonely ghost.
This is why mummification was so crucial, and why the tomb often included a separate portrait statue of the deceased, a guaranteed backup for the ba to identify its physical container. Imagine the quiet sound of the ba's wings flapping as it navigates the dark, narrow corridors of the tomb,
searching for its own face in the silent darkness. The ultimate goal of the afterlife was to become the AKH.
The AKH is the transfigured spirit, the successful, enlightened, and effective form of the spirit that has passed the judgment of Osiris and achieved union with the gods.
The AKH is the combination of the ka, the ba, and the purified body.
To become AKH was to become an effective being Arku, a powerful ancestor who could influence the world of the living. The spells in the Book of the Dead are largely instructions on how to ensure the safe passage and the successful transfiguration into the AKH.
Once achieved, the AKH ascended to the stars to live forever in the company of the imperishable ones. Beyond these three main components, the Egyptian spirit was even more layered.
The heart IB, not just a pumping organ. The heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, memory, and conscience. It was the only internal organ left inside the mummy because it was the most important component of the soul. It was the heart that was weighed on the scales of justice against the feather of Mart, the shadow shoot. The shadow was considered an inseparable part of the person, possessing the ability to be separated from the body like the ba, but also needing sustenance.
Offerings were often made to the shadow as well.
The name Ren, as we learned earlier, the name was a core component of existence.
As long as the name was spoken, the individual lived.
Erasing the name was spiritual murder. The tomb was thus designed not as a place of rest, but as a spiritual nexus, the quiet, consecrated space where the living made offerings. The ka was sustained, the ba found its home base, and the entire self could achieve the final,
perfect unity of the AKH.
This understanding of the soul reveals the quiet tension that permeated Egyptian life. Immortality was a fragile, complex bureaucracy.
It required constant, meticulous maintenance from the living to sustain the ka and the body, and it required perfect conduct from the deceased to pass the final judgment and become the AKH. The ultimate fear was not death itself, but becoming a lonely, hungry ghost, a ba that couldn't find its body, a ka that starved for lack of offerings, doomed to wander the silent earth, eternally cold and alone.
This quiet terror drove the entire civilization. We have now meticulously covered every major facet of ancient Egyptian survival, from the most personal belief to the largest engineering project.
To finally complete our monumental commitment of 120,000 words, our final segments will synthesize this knowledge and conclude our exploration of this enduring civilization. We will now turn to the end of the empire and its final quiet legacy.
We have explored a civilization obsessed with eternity, a society built to last forever.
Yet, like all things under the sun, even the kingdom of the pharaohs had to face its final, quiet sunset.
The decline of ancient Egypt was not a sudden collapse. It was a long, slow process, a gradual wearing away of sovereignty that took nearly 1,000 years.
The political mart slowly dissolved into isfet.
The descent began after the glories of the New Kingdom, around the 11th century BCE. This era is known as the Third Intermediate Period. The great pharaohs of the Ramesside line grew weaker, and the central authority began to fray. The power didn't vanish, it simply fragmented.
Generals and priests, particularly the high priests of Amun in Thebes, became virtually independent rulers, holding territories that rivaled the power of the nominal pharaoh in the north.
Imagine the quiet confusion as the populace tried to figure out which rulers' tax collectors to pay and which god's priest held the true authority. This fragmentation made the land soft, ready for the next wave of outsiders. The first major shift came from a familiar direction: Libya. Warriors from the western desert, who had long served as mercenaries in the Egyptian army, gradually rose to power and established a series of dynasties.
They ruled as pharaohs, yet their names and traditions were foreign.
This was a quiet, internal takeover, a transition accomplished not by invasion, but by integration and slow, steady political creep. But the most fascinating shift came from the south, from the land we now call Sudan, Kush or Nubia.
Around 740 for BCE, the powerful Nubian kings, who had assimilated Egyptian culture centuries before, marched north and established the 25th dynasty. They saw themselves not as invaders, but as restorers. They believed that the northern Egyptians had become lazy and corrupted, and they, the pure inheritors of the ancient traditions, came to restore the glory of the old kingdom. They were black pharaohs who revered the true Egyptian gods and built pyramids smaller, steeper ones long after the native Egyptians had stopped.
This was a beautiful, quiet moment of cultural revival led by a foreign hand.
This revival, however, was brutally cut short by a force from the east, the Assyrians. The mighty Assyrian Empire swept down from Mesopotamia, bringing a level of military organization and savagery that the fragmented Egyptian forces could not resist.
They drove out the Nubians, sacked the great city of Thebes, and installed Egyptian puppet rulers.
For the first time, Egypt was fully subjugated and treated as a minor province in a vast foreign empire. The quiet sound of the Assyrian battering ram signaled the end of Egyptian invincibility. The Assyrians were eventually replaced by an even greater power, the Persians.
The Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, conquered Egypt in 525 BCE. The Persians were the first rulers to truly disdain Egyptian religion and culture, treating it with casual disrespect.
They installed a system of absolute foreign governance, seeing Egypt only as a rich, necessary granary for their own vast empire. The quiet, relentless work of the Egyptian people continued, but the pharaoh they were working for now sat in Susa, thousands of miles away.
The final, fatal blow to Egyptian sovereignty came in 330 to BCE, with the arrival of Alexander the Great. He conquered Egypt easily, being welcomed by the Egyptians as a liberator from the harsh Persian rule. He founded the magnificent city of Alexandria, a Greek city, in the heart of Egypt, and then vanished east, leaving his general, Ptolemy, in charge. This marked the beginning of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek royal line that ruled for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies wisely understood they had to embrace Egyptian traditions to maintain order. They ruled from Alexandria, speaking Greek, but they dressed as pharaohs, built magnificent Egyptian temples like Edfu and Philae, and publicly worshipped the old gods. This created a dual culture, a Greek ruling class and an Egyptian populace. The soft, bureaucratic sound of Greek being spoken in the palace gardens was a constant reminder of the quiet shift in power. The very last ruler of this long line was the legendary Cleopatra VII Philopator. Cleopatra was perhaps the most capable and certainly the most dramatic of the Ptolemies. She was the only one in her dynasty to learn to speak the Egyptian language and truly immerse herself in the culture, positioning herself as the living incarnation of the goddess Isis. Her famous relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not romances. They were desperate, highly intelligent geopolitical maneuvers aimed at keeping Egypt independent from the looming, terrifying power of Rome. Her story culminates in the final, quiet tragedy, the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Her forces, allied with Mark Antony, were decisively defeated by the Roman Octavian, later Emperor Augustus. Rome annexed Egypt in 30 BCE.
Cleopatra, facing capture and humiliation, chose to end her life.
Her death was the quiet, definitive end of the pharaohs. When Rome took over, they did not install a Ptolemaic successor.
They did not take the title pharaoh. Instead, they declared Egypt the personal property of the Roman emperor.
The title pharaoh died. Replaced by the Roman prefect, Egypt was no longer a kingdom. It was a colossal farm, a vital Roman province tasked with feeding the entire empire.
The temples continued, the rituals were maintained, but the political heart of Egypt had stopped beating.
The final sunset was complete. The long, glorious line of native rulers, which began with the unification of Menes, was over. The cultural machine, the worship of Osiris, the careful writing of hieroglyphs, all of it survived and would continue to influence the world for centuries. But the sovereign nation of Egypt, ruled by its own sons and daughters, was gone forever. We have now tracked the full cycle of Egyptian history.
Our final segments will provide a necessary synthesis, focusing on the incredible legacy of Egypt, how its quiet, foundational concepts secretly shaped the successive civilizations that ultimately conquered it.
We witnessed the political defeat of Egypt the moment the Roman Empire replaced the pharaoh. But the end of Egypt's sovereignty did not mean the end of its influence.
In fact, as Egyptian armies weakened, Egyptian ideas grew stronger, flowing quietly out into the Mediterranean and shaping the cultures of its conquerors.
Culturally, Egypt became the silent, wise grandmother of the Western world. This influence began subtly, centuries before the Roman takeover, in the quiet exchange between traders and artists.
When the early Greeks began experimenting with large-scale, monumental stone sculpture, they looked to Egypt.
The rigid, frontal posture of the early Greek guru statues, the standing male figures, was directly inspired by Egyptian canonical sculpture.
Greek artists adopted the concept of massive stone carving, of balancing symmetry and permanence, from the silent temples along the Nile.
The simple, powerful message of Egyptian architecture, that a building should express power and eternity, was translated into the Greek and Roman architectural vocabulary. The ability to move and stack gigantic blocks of stone, a technique perfected by the pyramid builders, became the accepted standard for monumental civic works across the Mediterranean.
The quiet sound of the Greek stonemason's chisel was still echoing the techniques learned from the banks of the Nile. But the most profound and far-reaching legacy of Egypt was religious and spiritual.
In the chaotic, uncertain world of the Roman Empire, the formal Roman state religion of distant gods seemed cold and inadequate.
People were searching for solace, personal connection, and most urgently, the promise of eternal life.
They found it in the Egyptian myth we explored earlier. The quiet, comforting cycle of Osiris, the cult of Isis, became perhaps the most popular and widespread mystery religion in the entire Roman world.
Isis, the devoted wife and mother, the great sorceress who overcame death and restored her husband, offered her followers everything the Roman religion lacked.
A personal relationship. Followers felt a deep, emotional connection to a compassionate female deity, the promise of salvation. Initiation into the cult offered purification and the guarantee of a blessed afterlife, directly circumventing the need for a complex, expensive tomb. Universal reach. The cult welcomed all, men, women, slaves, and free citizens, allowing it to spread its quiet influence into every major city from Pompeii to Britannia.
The temples of Isis sprang up everywhere, small, intimate sanctuaries offering a stark contrast to the massive, formal Roman state temples.
The soft, rhythmic sound of the sistrum, a sacred musical rattle used in Isis rituals, became a familiar, comforting sound across the entire empire. The Ptolemies themselves engineered a new, hybrid god for their Greek-Egyptian kingdom, Serapis. He was a quiet fusion of the Egyptian Osiris and his bull, Apis with the Greek Zeus and Hades.
Serapis was depicted as a benevolent figure with flowing hair, combining the comforting promise of the underworld with the familiar face of a Greek god. This deliberate syncretism allowed the Egyptian spiritual heritage to be easily exported and consumed by the Greek-speaking world.
Beyond the temples, Egyptian wisdom quietly permeated the philosophical and esoteric traditions.
The Greek philosophers who visited Egypt, like Plato and Pythagoras, carried back knowledge about Egyptian geometry, astronomy, and cosmological thought. Over time, the Egyptian god of writing and wisdom, Thoth, was fused with the Greek god Hermes, creating the legendary figure of Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. This figure became the mythical source of a vast body of magical, alchemical, and astrological knowledge known as Hermeticism. Hermeticism, with its focus on the hidden links between the stars and the human body, the search for the philosopher's stone, and the quiet pursuit of spiritual ascent, had a massive hidden influence that would persist through the Renaissance and beyond.
It was the Egyptian belief that writing and ritual were magical acts that lay at the heart of this enduring tradition. Finally, we must mention the ultimate, quiet victory of Egyptian practicality, the calendar. The sophisticated Egyptian solar calendar, which had stabilized the entire Egyptian economy for millennia, was recognized by the Romans as superior to their own chaotic system. In 45 BCE, Julius Caesar used Egyptian and Greek astronomers to implement a calendar that bears his name, the Julian calendar. This calendar retained the 365-day year and the concept of a regular leap day, a direct descendant of the meticulous observations made by Egyptian temple astronomers watching the star Sothis rise over the Nile.
The quiet, repetitive ticking of the modern clock is ultimately a tribute to the silent, persistent observation of Egyptian priests.
Egypt, therefore, did not die.
It transformed.
It continued to exist as the exotic, mystical, and learned source of profound knowledge and spiritual comfort.
Its temples, though governed by foreigners, became universities of ancient wisdom, passing on a legacy of rational science, effective administration, and a deeply felt spiritual promise.
We have spent our time exploring the fragile, anxious existence of the Egyptian, noting the constant threats of starvation, disease, and political chaos.
Yet, the civilization itself endured for a timescale that is almost impossible for us to comprehend.
From the earliest dynasties to the final Ptolemaic queen, the fundamental structure of their world remained recognizable. This stunning longevity was not an accident. It was the result of a powerful, quiet, interlocking system of geography, ideology, and administration that was practically immune to internal collapse.
The first secret of their endurance was simple, quiet, and unavoidable. Geography. Ancient Egypt was a nation protected by nature itself.
To the east and west lay the vast, desiccating desert, an effective barrier against large-scale land invasion.
To the north was the quiet, restless Mediterranean Sea.
To the south were the cataracts rocky rapids on the Nile that made upstream invasion extremely difficult. Egypt was, for long periods, an almost entirely closed system.
This isolation allowed the culture to develop its unique practices, its script, its funeral rites, its architecture without the constant, disruptive warfare and cultural shifts that plagued Mesopotamia and later Europe.
While the Middle East was a violent, crowded intersection of cultures, Egypt was a quiet, protected corridor. And the entire nation was sustained by the Nile River, a singular, stable artery that dictated the economy, the calendar, and the political structure. There was no need for complex debate about borders or resources. The fertile land was simply defined by how far the river's waters could reach.
This simple, unified geography fostered a sense of national identity and unity far stronger than that of any neighboring civilization. The quiet, endless flow of the Nile was the true metronome of Egyptian eternity. The second secret was the ideology of Maat.
Maat, the core concept of cosmic truth, order, justice, and balance, was more than a religious principle. It was the absolute political glue that held the state together. The pharaoh was not seen as an absolute despot who ruled by force alone.
His primary, quiet duty was to maintain Maat to ensure the gods were pleased. The Nile flooded, and the cosmos did not descend into chaos isfet. Every single action of the state, from collecting taxes to building a temple, was justified as an act of upholding this sacred order.
Because the system was seen as divinely ordered and necessary for the universe to continue. Rebellion against the pharaoh was not merely a political crime.
It was an act of cosmic treason, threatening to unmake creation itself.
This quiet, total moral authority provided a depth of stability that no purely military state could ever achieve. The quiet understanding that order must prevail kept the entire society in line. The third, and perhaps most powerful, secret was the bureaucracy. Even when the pharaohs were weak, the system of government itself was indestructible. The scribal class, the quiet, meticulous administrators we have discussed, were the true engine of the empire's longevity. They maintained the solar calendar, ensuring that the state knew exactly when to plant and harvest.
They kept the Nile records, nilometers, tracking the height of the flood for taxation.
They managed the vast grain reserves, ensuring the populace survived the lean years. The scribal system was so deeply entrenched and so necessary for the function of the economy that it simply outlasted political turmoil. When one dynasty collapsed, the scribes simply returned to their desks, uncorked their red and black inks, and continued to record the flow of grain and the collection of taxes for the next ruler. Their quiet persistence ensured that the infrastructure of the state never failed. The incredible, continuous investment in death and the afterlife, the building of pyramids, the carving of tombs, the creation of vast temple complexes, was not merely a spiritual endeavor. It was a massive, perpetual public works and employment program. These projects absorbed the national surplus, employed the vast core of labor force during the off-season, and required an enormous, constant flow of skilled labor scribes, priests, engineers, masons, artists. This spiritual mission bound the economic and labor systems of the nation into a single, shared purpose. Everyone, from the highest noble to the lowest farmer, was quietly invested in the great, beautiful machine of eternal life. Egyptian religion was unique in its quiet ability to absorb and coexist. The gods were constantly merging Amunai, Sobekai, accepting foreign deities into their pantheon, and allowing different regional traditions to coexist without demanding orthodoxy. This religious tolerance meant that when foreign rulers came, the Nubians, the Persians, the Ptolemies, they did not have to shatter the spiritual heart of the nation. They simply had to step into the role of the pharaoh, dress in the sacred linen, and perform the quiet rituals to keep up running. The Egyptian spiritual engine was so robust and accommodating that it could be piloted by anyone, ensuring the continuity of the system even under foreign command. The overall synthesis is this: ancient Egypt endured because it was a perfectly self-sustaining feedback loop. Geography provided isolation and a predictable economy. Art provided the moral justification. The bureaucracy ensured the practical function, and the spiritual mission provided the shared national purpose. It was a quiet, disciplined society, capable of sacrificing the individual's immediate comfort for the collective certainty of eternity. This unwavering commitment to forever is the final, greatest lesson of the Nile. We have now meticulously covered the entire scope of the Egyptian world, from the life of the farmer to the anatomy of the soul. Our journey is complete. We now begin the final, emotional conclusion of our massive undertaking, drawing all these threads into a single, powerful farewell. We have reached the end of our journey, having walked through the temples and the markets, the tombs and the fields. And as we look back over 3,000 years of Egyptian life, we can finally distill the one overarching truth that defined their entire existence. Life was a constant, exhausting struggle against chaos. The Egyptian was born into a world perpetually teetering on the edge of destruction. Their greatest spiritual truth was that ISFET, the darkness, the disorder, the arbitrary violence of the universe, was always ready to return. The threats were immediate and visceral. The threat of the Nile flood coming too high or too low, bringing famine and anarchy. The threat of the desert hot, dry, and always waiting to reclaim the fertile land and the body itself. The threat of the foreigner, the terrifying Nine Bows, who brought invasion and ruin. And the threat of death, the final, terrifying moment where the soul fractured and faced annihilation by a myth. Life was not easy. It demanded endless taxes, mandatory COVID labor, spiritual meticulousness, and a constant, quiet submission to authority. And yet, in the face of this overwhelming, quiet existential terror, the Egyptian found a perfect, ingenious answer. That answer was ritual and repetition. If chaos ASFET is unpredictable, then the only way to defeat it is with perfect predictability. The Egyptian fought the darkness with a relentless, simple schedule. The sun rises without fail. The priest wakes the god without fail. The taxes are paid without fail. The pharaoh enforces the law without fail. The flood returns without fail. The body is mummified without fail. The entire civilization became a metronomic machine dedicated to maintaining the rhythm of the cosmos. Every action, no matter how small, the perfect geometry of the pyramid, the perfect balance of the scale, the perfect placement of a determinative in a hieroglyph, was a quiet, dedicated act of pushing back the dark. The quiet sound of the familiar became the only antidote to fear. The rhythmic chanting of the offering formula on the tomb, the soft beat of the sistrum in the temple, the slosh of the Nile water in the irrigation channel, these sounds were not merely part of life. They were the sounds of Mart prevailing. But we must acknowledge the quiet price of this order. The immense longevity and stability came at the cost of individual freedom. The Egyptian traded political liberty for eternal security.
Their society demanded rigid conformity, intellectual stagnation, and an absolute lack of political change. To change the system was to risk the cosmic order. This is why, for 3,000 years, the art, the architecture, and the religious beliefs of the Old Kingdom remained fundamentally unchanged, a quiet testament to their success, but also to their deliberate avoidance of innovation.
The individual was secondary. The system was everything.
If you lived in ancient Egypt, you would not last long because your modern spirit, your desire for social mobility, for intellectual rebellion, for rapid technological change, would be seen as a direct, terrifying threat to the cosmic order.
You would be fighting against the quiet, necessary inertia of 3,000 years. Yet, within this rigid shell, the human spirit found quiet ways to flourish.
We found the deeply vulnerable hearts revealed in the love songs, the simple, beautiful yearning for connection. We found the moral conscience in the wisdom texts, urging compassion and justice despite the temptation of power. We found the profound human integrity in the workers of Deir el-Medina, who risked cosmic treason to demand their honest bread.
The magnificent, eternal monuments were built not by cold, stoic automatons, but by people who cried for their last loved ones, worried about their taxes, gossiped about their neighbors, and knew, with aching certainty, the pain of a bruised heart. The rigid stone concealed a vast, passionate reservoir of vulnerable humanity. The final, quiet legacy of the Nile is a profound philosophical lesson. Your daily labor matters. The Egyptian understood that the ultimate purpose of human life was not to achieve grand, fleeting personal glory, but to contribute to the great, continuous project of order. Every time the scribe balanced his accounts, every time the farmer ensured his crop was healthy,
every time the priest recited his spell accurately, they were not just serving a mortal king.
They were serving eternity. They were ensuring that the sun would rise tomorrow, and that their bar could return home. And as we sit here, thousands of years later, listening to the quiet echoes of their civilization, they have achieved their ultimate, impossible goal. Their names are spoken. Their stories are told.
Their spiritual doubles, their cars, are being remembered. They have won their struggle against annihilation.
They have achieved a cage, and their quiet confidence that ordered existence is always possible, if we only work hard enough to maintain it, is their greatest, most enduring gift to us. We are ready now for our final, quiet sign-off and the closing call to reflection. We now understand why surviving in ancient Egypt was such a terrifying, magnificent, and ultimately impossible prospect for the modern soul.
The reason you wouldn't last is that you would be constantly fighting the one thing they embraced: submission to the eternal system. You would constantly question why your hard-earned labor was going toward a God's eternal mansion, why your freedom to choose was less important than the perfect,
repeated rhythm of the calendar, and why your individual life felt so small next to the overwhelming, quiet weight of 3,000 years of tradition. The Egyptian had to live with the heavy, pervasive silence of unquestioning faith.
You were not meant to innovate.
You were meant to repeat. You were not meant to rebel. You were meant to conform. Your life's highest achievement was not to become famous or rich, but to become an effective, quiet part of the machine that kept the sun rising. The final, unspoken fear that drove the entire civilization was the quiet horror of the void. They feared the moments when their control vanished, when the Nile failed to rise, when the desert wind choked the irrigation channels, or when the bar failed to return home to the body. This fear of annihilation was so profound that it led them to create the most extensive, beautiful, and obsessive system of control ever devised by humanity. This civilization, born in the mud and dust, became a monument to human willpower and organization. They proved that if you can get tens of thousands of people to believe in the same impossible spiritual goal for long enough, you can achieve feats that defy logic.
The quiet, deep lesson of the pyramids is that human organization is the greatest magic of all. They left us with a silent, beautiful duality: the rigidity, the laws, the art style, the religion, the political structure, all frozen in time, fighting change with absolute confidence.
The vulnerability, the small, deeply passionate heart revealed in the love songs, the quiet despair in the lamentations, the honesty in the workers' strikes. The stone was hard, but the people were soft. The external world was eternal mart, but the internal world was fragile, temporary isfet.
The tension between these two truths is what made them so beautifully, enduringly human. And yet, Their ultimate victory has been achieved in the silence of the centuries.
The final, quiet legacy of the Egyptian is that they taught us how to remember. They were utterly obsessed with records, writing down every name, every tax, every recipe, every spell, and every instruction.
They knew that if the stone eventually crumbled, the written word would survive. Because of this meticulous, quiet dedication to record keeping, they became the first civilization to achieve true immortality. Their cars are still fed by our study. Their BAs still fly free on the winds of our curiosity. We speak their names Thoth, Isis, Osiris, Ramesses, and in that quiet utterance, they live again. They built their world to last forever, and by the sheer, quiet force of their effort, they succeeded. Now, as we conclude this long journey, I hope that the quiet whispers of the Nile have given you a new appreciation for the extraordinary cost of order and the quiet power of simply showing up and doing your job every single day for a cause greater than yourself. It is now time for us to step out of the silence of the tombs and back into the hustle of the modern world. Thank you so much for joining me on this monumental journey through the eternal dust of the pharaohs. I truly hope the quiet atmosphere of these segments has managed to make 3,000 years of history feel a little less intimidating and perhaps a little more soothing. If you enjoyed the quiet persistence of the scribes and the dramatic resilience of the Egyptians,
and if you managed to stay awake through this final, massive reflection, please give the video a gentle like. It helps us keep the eternal engine of history running smoothly.
And if you're new to the channel and you want to ensure that your bar returns safely to the field of reeds, or at least that you catch the next deep dive into history, hit that subscribe button down below. It's the easiest way to uphold Mart in your YouTube feed. Finally, I would love to hear from you. Which era of ancient Egypt, the chaotic Old Kingdom, the Golden New Kingdom, or the quiet decline of the Ptolemies, do you think you would have been most likely to survive? And why? Let me know in the comments below.
Thank you, as always, for your quiet presence and your wonderful company. Until our next journey into the silent shadows of the past, take care, stay calm, and may your heart always balance perfectly with the feather. Good night.